Continuing the Diablo 2 unique series, Amazon's weirdly got both the most class-specific uniques and the least depending on how you look at it, with 6 total uniques but only 2 uniques that fit into each of their weapon categories, with 1 exceptional and 1 elite of each type. So for this one, we'll go by the type, starting with the least loved, the two-handed spears. In the exceptional slot, we have Lysander's Flank, the unique ceremonial pike, which overall isn't very bad as far as spears go, and is actually geared somewhat towards being used for a charge strike and lightning strike Amazon with the plus skills it packs, though it is far from the best for this and doesn't really do enough to compensate for the lack of resist you suffer from ditching the shield for a two-handed weapon. Though, in its defense, it does enough physical damage to help you overcome lightning immunes with the right setup, so it could be okay for a swap in some situations, but for the most part it sits collecting dust after I've gotten better options. The elite slot doesn't fare much better with Stone Raven, though on the plus side, Stone Raven does give you a little bit of help with resists, unlike Lysander's. The problem comes in that even with a perfect roll, it does not match the plus skills of Lysander's and doesn't really improve the damage output much physically, to the point where an upgraded Lysander's will generally be better of the two for normal play outside of extra bits of survivability from resist that you could get elsewhere. Why these two get dismissed so quickly is actually because of their competition in javelins, most notably the ever-popular Titan's Revenge, the ceremonial javelins that are infamous for their use by Javazon builds across the board. The reason they are so popular is a mix of plus skills, run walk, decent damage stats, and auto-replenishing, which makes them insanely good for use with Lightning Fury. There's very few pieces of gear that really can compete with this for spear and javelin skills, sadly, which is why you rarely hear of builds using things other than this in the javelin slot, outside of the elusive 640 blues or 440 rares, which most people will never find outside of trading online. The less loved, but still strong big brother of Titans are the Thunderstroke Matriarchal Javelins, which, while still fitting the theme of the elite class specific items generally being inferior to the exceptional class specific items, they can still be pretty powerful, with on average slightly lower plus skills, but able to match them with a lucky roll due to varying between 2 and 4 javelin skills, and minus enemy lightning resist. These make good killers for enemies with high lightning resists, or lightning resists that have been broken by an Infinity Mercenary, for example, or a Conviction Paladin. As far as the main use, they can't be competing with Titans, but they still output a lot of damage with charged and lightning strikes, though I'd avoid Lightning Fury outside of the occasional use because they lack self-replenishment and you will burn through an 80 stack of them quite quickly. Now, since we've gotten through the poking sticks, we are going to move on to bows, which are in a weird space since the exceptional one, Lysander's Aim, is actually really good, but more so for the less popular Magezon build, rather than the more popular Strafers and multi-shot Amazons. This is mostly because it focuses on mana leech and plus skills, and similar stats to Lysander's Flank rather than pumping physical damage and extreme speeds like you see in bows preferred by the more physically oriented bow builds. Generally, you'll see this bow competing with the likes of Ice and Phoenix and a few others, which it will generally struggle to beat the perks of. And finally, we have the elite Amazon bow, simply called Bloodraven's Charge. It doesn't fare nearly as well, sadly, especially since it really lacks much to make it stand out outside of the natural level 13 exploding arrow in place of normal attack. Outside of that, it's just got the same damage as Lysander's, sometimes even lower, more variable plus skills, which means it can make your elemental arrows even less impressive, though on a plus side, I guess, the exploding arrows do get a synergy bonus from Fire Arrow, though if you're going for that, Brand actually has a higher base exploding arrow than this at level 15. So while interesting, it's just hard to really justify Bloodraven's Charge over other easier to get bows. So, do you use any of the Amazon-specific weapons? If so, which ones do you prefer and why? Mention them down below, and as always, a special thanks to the channel members, patrons, and regular viewers that make this content possible. In Diablo 2, there are a lot of unique items, but due to how they were introduced, the class-specific items generally got far more limited representation. In the case of today's video, we look at one of the most severe cases of this, with Unique Claws, where they only have a grand total of 4 uniques, with most people usually only recognizing 1 or 2 of them. This underrepresentation is also one of the big reasons why people don't recognize just how much their magic find is, well, actually working, and is why so many rare claws you'll find actually have triple the normal durability. As usual, we're going to go by level requirement, starting with the most famous and desired of the unique claws, Bartuk's Cutthroat Greater Talons. For an item that only requires level 42 and is able to be found in plenty of locations in Nightmare and Hell, this weapon still earns its reputation with solid damage, stat boost, faster hit recovery, leech, and plus skills, as well as a reasonable stat requirement. Its usefulness for such a wide array of assassin builds makes it a hard claw to ignore, and even though it's not the best in slot for most of them, it's definitely competitive in the top top echelons for most of them. Moving into the elite claws though, which are harder to find, we start with Jade Talon, the wrist sword, most known for being the resistance claw. It packs good damage for a one-handed weapon, being on par with Bartuks in that regard. It also has a few plus skills for martial arts and shadow disciplines, as well as packing faster hit recovery similar to, well, Bartuks. Where this claw falls short though is that there really isn't much that sets it apart from its competition, though it can sometimes be a good one-off offhand weapon for the resist if you're going to be using the assassin weapon block, but there are usually better options in most cases for your offhand. Next is one of the weird claws in Fire Lizard's Talons, which as their name implies, they're fire-themed claws, with variable plus skills to Wake of Inferno and Wake of Fire, and also a broad plus skills for martial arts. It can feel a bit confused in that regard, but outside of that, they're just reasonable damage claws with chunky fire damage and increased attack speed, with highly variable fire resist tacked on. I've tried a few times to decide a good use for these, but almost always seem to fall back on just the claw rune words, or even some shoppable claws depending on my build. And finally, we have Shadow Killer, the permanently ethereal battle cestus, which thankfully also comes with the indestructible mod. Due to being ethereal and getting okay bonuses, it is the highest physical damage of the unique claws in the game. Also packs some defense reduction, target freezing, mana per kill, as well as a fairly big 33% chance to cast a low-level Frost Nova each time you strike with it. Though the reality is, while in and of itself it's, well, fine, it just lacks anything particularly overpowered either, and it sort of suffers the same fate of similar elemental-themed uniques in other weapon types just by being just meh. Overall, the unique claws are underwhelming, especially compared to their weapon-specific rune words like Chaos, that you can find linked in the end screen of this video, by the way. We have a whole video on that. With the advancement of Resurrection, maybe, just maybe, we can hold out the hope of something changing that, maybe getting more unique claws, since there is an entire slew of, well, claw types for each tier that potentially they could add uniques to. And as always, yeah, despite the underwhelming nature of these, we do still want to thank you guys, the patrons, the members, the regular viewers, for making the item catalog videos possible, especially for these less loved ones that will generally get less views, but hey, it's still fun to make them. As with most of the Diablo 2 class-specific unique sets, the Barbarian list is woefully short, at only 4 helmets, though unlike some of the others, there is at least some reason to consider 2 of them as an interesting option, so let's dive on in. First, I'm going to break the pattern of the last few videos and focus on getting the less interesting ones out of the way first, and then we'll get into the ones that I actually find fun. So we'll start with the frustrating bunny helmet called Demon Horn's Edge, which belongs at the bottom of any list simply for its god-awful aesthetics, since, if you couldn't tell, I do not like the horned helmet aesthetic at all, and its stats do not help with this. With wildly variable plus skills, a mediocre attack speed boost, low life leech, and some attacker takes damage effect, it just doesn't cut the bill even against more mediocre off-class helmets stat-wise, so I just cannot recommend it even for people trying to be different. A similarly mundane but at least less garbage option, simply because it doesn't look like a freaking bunny, is Halberd's Reign, the unique Conqueror crown, which actually packs at least an okay plus skill, even if it's not super impressive overall. It packs a fairly big replenished life value and has a shale's worth of hit recovery, but that's about it. And while this can be okay for pre-buffing battle orders, it's generally not going to be worth using in the long run simply because it doesn't bring enough to the table, and you can get much better options for that pre-buff effect a lot easier, even if you want to bother with just using that at all. Though on the more fun end, we actually have another helmet with War Cries, more precisely +2 to 3 to all War Cries, that at least fits its name, and that is the Wolf Howl, the Fury Visor. While it is pretty much just a stat helm as far as non-skill modifiers go, with variable strength, dexterity, and vitality, it's also unique in the way that it's the only method of obtaining an off-druid werewolf shape change, thanks to the random plus skills to Feral Rage, Lycanthropy, and Werewolf, which can be fun to mess around with. This helmet can also be handy if you're working on playing a Beast Barbarian and want to increase the duration of the Werebear shape change as well, thanks to that Lycanthropy shift, of course. Are there any of these changes meta? No, but they are fun, and they're definitely worth messing around with whenever you get into the post-game experimentation stage of your time with Diablo 2. Saving easily the best for last, we have Ariat's Face, the one that you're probably already most familiar with, and that's because it's hand over fist better than any of the other Barbarian helmet options, and easily the only one that can directly compete with off-class Barbarian helmets. With better hit recovery than halberds, same amount of leech as demon hordes, solid plus skills, decent stats, resist all, even a pinch of attack rating, it's actually a good helmet, despite only being exceptional, and only requiring level 42 to equip it on top of all of this. There's a reason it's a fairly common helmet among barbarians, and if you're a barbarian, you probably want at least one in your stash somewhere. Overall, while most of the barbarian helmets are kind of bad compared to their competition, there is one interesting and fun helmet with niche uses that a lot of people probably won't have had the chance to have fun with, and one helmet that is genuinely good, and it happens to be just the lowest level requirement one of the bunch. So do you wish there were more unique barbarian helmets, or would you rather they focus on something else instead? Mention it down below, and as always, a special thanks to the channel members, patrons, and regular viewers that make this content possible. As with most of the class-specific uniques in Diablo 2, the Druid pelts are fairly limited in quantity, with only 4 of them being present, but unlike the others, while one does stand out as generally the best, they can all be somewhat useful until you get your endgame gear and are not easily beaten by simple magic items. That said, they are still a bit of a pain to find thanks to 3 of the uniques being in elite bases and only 1 being in an exceptional base. And it's easily the most popular of the unique Druid pelts, and that's Jalal's Mane. It's just an all-around good helmet, especially for shape-shifting druids thanks to the solid plus skills, resist all, stats, hit recovery, and a few other nice minor boosts. I'll generally keep a couple of these packed away for slotting with various runes or jewels, since they're relatively common and can be modified for a few use cases. Even though they're not always best in slot, they're just reliable and balanced. In the elite slots though, we have a bit more focus, with things like Cerebus Bite, with a lot more focus on the melee bonuses like a bigger attack rating boost, life leech, open wounds, and a very shapeshift focused kind of plus skills setup, as well as Feral Rage, making it lean very much into the realm of Werewolf Druid. While it's not the best in slot for this, these bonuses are sufficient to make a decent enough build with the helmet. Raven lore is fairly similar, but for the Fire Elemental Druid, with plus skills, some random ravens for blinding, as well as energy resistances and a pinch of fire-resistant pierce, so we can actually do some damage there. Especially if they end up making the fire tree for the druid more viable, this could actually see a bump into being somewhat useful, since that enemy fire resistance effect could be fairly important for this, even though you can get more plus skills from other sources, at least for specific builds. Lastly, we have the Spirit Keeper, which unfortunately has always felt like a disappointing weaker version of Jalal's Mane to me, with weaker melee bonuses, less plus skills, worse resists, though it does actually pack some absorb that can be useful. The reason this is really disappointing for me is, after the wolf heads, the antler helms are pretty much a close second favorite aesthetically for me, so I really wish there were better options for that pelt, especially with how uncommon it is. Overall, with the Druid, you'll often be going with non-unique helms, unfortunately, because those will be your best in-slot items, but the uniques still have very specific build focuses to them for the most part, and one that's just good general use if you're unsure about a specific helmet. This is especially more in line with what I think the unique should be, since it lets you have the useful reliability of a well-named item, while still having the potential of better options if you go for rares. That said, what do you think is the most balanced class-specific group of uniques in the game? Are there some groups that are overpowered, or some that are woefully underpowered? Mention it down below, and as always, special thanks to all the channel supporters that make this content possible. To continue with unique item videos for Diablo 2, we're here to take a look at another class-specific item, the Necromancer-specific Shrunken Heads. As with all class-specific items, they sadly got underrepresented, this time with only 3 items. And with only a limited number of possible sockets in the base items, there's very few rune words for competition either, at least outside of the mid-tier rune words like Splendor and Rhyme. As usual though, let's knock out the exceptional Necromancer head first with Homunculus, the unique Hierophant trophy that is easily one of the most popular shield choices for a number of Necromancer builds, giving decent plus skills, excellent blocking compared to other Necromancer options, a good bit of mana help, and a good resist all modifier. There's really nothing to complain about with the shield, and while other shields can give you a bit more punch, the Homunculus is generally going to be a safe bet if you're unsure as to what shield you want on your Necromancer and just want something that will pretty much always work. In the elite category, we have the other two unique necroheads. First with Dark Force Spawn, which, while having a lot more limited options, is useful for necromancers that need the ability to spam their spells a little bit faster, since it comes with increased cast rate, a mana boost, and variable plus skills for each tree. Generally speaking, you're not going to get much value from it unless the Poison Bone tree rolls its max level of 3, and even then, for almost every necromancer build, there will be an easier to obtain and better shield option than Dark Force. As far as the other elite necrohead, Blown Flame, or Blown Flamme, does have some nice uses, especially due to its ability to get a variable amount of plus all skills, up to 3 in fact, as well as still packing decent resists. And while it gives up blocking for faster run walk, this isn't a major deal breaker for most necromancers. The only downside is a similar downside to Homunculus, and that is a lack of faster cast, which can make it a little weaker option for a Bone Mancer, since they want that casting speed that shields like Spirit can provide. But this makes a stronger option for people like Poison Mancers and Summoners that can do much more with the extra plus skill and usually don't need the mana perks or blocking of Homunculus. Overall, the Necromancer heads are interesting in that they would be absolutely terrible for other classes, but due to the Necromancer's limited reliance on cast rate outside of Bone Mancer or some Enigma users, he can get away with the more sluggish shields, though in the long run, outside of Homunculus, the value appeal of a good rare Necrohead cannot be ignored, and for mid-tier options, you do still have the value of Splendor and a good base head with the right plus skills for your build, and Rhyme for the more kind of combat-oriented Necromancer. If you could make your own new Necromancer head, what would you put on it and why? What build would it improve the viability of? While we likely won't see them implemented, it's kind of neat to see where people would fill the gap in the options. And as always, thanks to the patrons, channel members, and regular viewers that make our ability to explore these ideas possible. Paladins are in a bit of an odd space with class-specific uniques, since while they're still very limited in quantity with only 3 shields, they are also unique in that they have to compete with one of the only 2 class-specific runewords in the game, in the Paladin's case, Exile, which means the bar for good is a lot higher than with other class-specific uniques. That said, as usual with class-specific uniques in Diablo 2, there is still a quite solid option in your level 42 unique, along with some weirdly niche and mediocre elite options. One of those weird niche uniques is the level 80 requirement Fire Center Dragon Scale, which while I can think of some fringe uses for it, with its boost to fire damage as well as fire absorb, the reality is there are far better choices with much lower level requirements that you can even put in the Zakarum shield base that just do it better. Slightly less boggling, but still not my favorite, is the unique Alma Negra, with still a relatively high level requirement of 77, the shield pretty much just comes in as slightly better than a Priest Paladin shield of deflecting. The main difference being this would have a bit more defense and gives a % attack rating boost rather than a flat boost like you'd find on the Magic Paladin shield with the right auto mod. It does have a decent amount of defense, and it's not an objectively bad shield, it's just never going to be best in slot, even with the % enhanced damage and attack rating boost. This is mostly because those can be found on a large number of socketed Paladin shields, which you can slap a whole rune word into. The cream of the crop for the Paladin shields, though, is the ever-famous Herald of Zakarum, one of the few shields in the game that can give the Exile or Spirit rune words a run for their money for the Paladin build, since while for specialized builds it does lose out, but for flexible builds that have to fill multiple roles or solo large swaths of the game, its wide-reaching stats with blocking, attack rating, resistances, stats, and plus skills lets it go a long way towards a lot of useful strategies, and that is why it is easily one of the go-to Paladin shields when people are unsure as to what they want to use for their given character. Overall, while limited, the Paladin Uniques fare about the same as other class-specific uniques in Diablo 2, with a rather poor showing for most of them, but a shining gem packed in. Do you think they should add more class-specific uniques or even class-specific sets? Mention your ideas below and they might make their way into a future video I'm looking at for different item ideas. And as always, a special thanks to the channel members, patrons, and regular viewers that make this content possible. The Sorceress class uniques in Diablo 2 are a bit special in that every single one of them has popped up in a build guide at one point or another for various reasons, even if it's just for a very niche use, though this generally requires getting a reasonable roll on the less well-known ones. Speaking of the less well-known ones, let's actually start with the 2 elite orbs. First, Death's Fathom, the cold-oriented orb. It's only really ever used for very specific builds because, well, while it lacks Magic Find, which is one of the main goals of many Cold Sorceresses. But what it does have is the two more important resists of Fire and Lightning, as well as a solid +3 to all skills. It's got a bit of faster cast and a fairly decent boost of cold damage, ranging from about 15 to 30%, which can be pretty nice for whenever you're using other gear kind of in that orientation. That said, for doing Magic Find, there is usually a different option chosen, where this one is used more for just maximizing your damage output as a Cold Sorceress. Though speaking of damage output, the other elite orb helps with that, at least for those of you who aren't big fans of cold, and that's Eschuta's Temper, which packs in double the faster cast rate of Death's Fathom, as well as a +10 to 20% fire and lightning damage with a pinch of energy to help out on mana. The major drawbacks of this one, though, is you definitely need to have a bit of RNG luck on your side because, well, the plus skill values on it can range anywhere from a great +3 all the way down to a paltry +1, which lets it be kind of underwhelming at times. The other drawback is, unlike other orbs, this is just completely lacks any sort of resistance, so you're relying on your other gear to provide you with that extra durability. In regards to the most popular Sorceress Orb, at least among the Uniques, we have the Oculus. +3 all skills, plus vitality and energy, resist all, magic find, even mana per kill, and a fairly nice 30% faster cast, which splits the difference between the other two orbs. Sounds like a lovely piece of gear. At least until you accidentally drop into a pack of Frenzy Tours, then that 25% chance to cast Teleport kicks in, sending you around like a pinball at the receiving end of a drunken lunatic looking to throw about as many tilt errors as possible at a pinball table. Don't get me wrong, it's an amazing orb, but it does have serious risks if you're trying to stay alive with mid-tier gear, since it can drop you into, well, some pretty terrible situations. Overall, the Sorcerer's Orbs are what I'd rank as some of the best class-specific Uniques. That's why we released this video last out of the bunch, but it still has some pretty solid competition from outside to keep it on its toes, especially with stuff like Tal Rasha's set floating around, as well as a handful of the runeword options, like Heart of the Oak and Spirit. So, do you have a favorite group of class-specific Uniques, or do you think rares are where all the fun is? And what do you think about the Oculus Teleport? Is it at least better than the Oculus Quest? Mention it down below, and as always, keep gaming, have fun, and peace out. This has been Alzorath. Bye. There are a lot of items in Diablo 2, ranging from uniques and runewords to crafted items and rares, even all the way to set items that boost each other up. One of the most essential slots for these items in Diablo 2 is the Amulet slot, and while they receive tough competition from crafted items and even sets, the unique amulets are still extremely solid options for everything from early game to end game, so today we're going to take a look at them and discuss the wide array of uses they have. To minimize rage, we're actually going to do an experiment today and sort them from lowest level requirement up to highest level requirement, since this gives them all a fair chance to shine in their own individual niches, of which most of them have at least one use that they are actually amazing in. Starting off at the lowest level requirement, we have Nokazan Relic, an interesting little amulet that at first you'll likely notice is an overarching fire theme, with fire resist boosts and a minuscule amount of fire damage, but what sets it apart is actually the first line. 20% faster hit recovery. One of only 2 sources of this stat on an amulet, and it's the only one that is at 20%. While it's not going to usually make or break a build, it could be key to hitting the next breakpoint, especially on certain niche builds that it benefits. After that is Eye of Etlich, which has the distinction of being the earliest plus all skills amulet in the game outside of the 3-part angelic bonus. This amulet is just all around nice and can be gotten super early with plus skills, life leech, and a pinch of cold damage to slow enemies down. It's one of those amulets that can almost be useful on any low level character, and they'll be glad to find and use it. Even though it's not necessarily end game equipment, it's still quite solid. Next is the Mahimok Curio, another solid all-rounder, though this time leaning a bit more into the melee character field. It has a few stats that make it distinct, namely 10% bonus to attack rating and off armor 10% enhanced defense, which basically functions like a Defiance style boost. On top of that, it also has plus all attributes and resist, which just makes it nice in general to have for that little bit of extra durability that those are going to give you. A good but not great mid-level amulet is Sarrakon's Chance, most known for being the Iron Maiden amulet. It also packs attributes and resist that make it a reasonable pick for a lot of characters, though unfortunately not best in slot since it can be pretty easily outclassed by rares of a similar level. Would I say no to it? No, but it's never really my first pick for any kind of like normal build. That said, this next one is an amulet that I used to love using back in the day, but has sadly fallen out of favor for a few reasons, and that is Crescent Moon, the dual leech amulet, usually packing fairly decent percents for both life leech and mana leech among some other okay mods. It's still a good amulet, especially while you're still getting your mana in check for a build like a Strafer or a Frenzy Barb. It will eventually be outclassed by other uniques and rares, but it's still a fairly good amulet if you do need that leech. After that, we have an amulet that most new players will overlook, and that is the Cat's Eye amulet. It packs the distinction of being an amazing speed-oriented amulet with faster run walk and increased attack speed on an amulet packed with some defensive boosts and a fairly solid chunk of dexterity. It's actually a really good amulet that suffers a fate similar to safety amulets in that it's overlooked because, well, people who know how it works realize how good it is, but for some reason most people outside of that don't catch on to it because it's not the popular endgame GG item. Next, we have Atmos Scarab, a unique that I am in a love-hate kind of relationship with, in that it's one of those uniques that I would love to plug into a lot of builds, but that generally doesn't fit into too many. While it has a few good boosts like poison resist and a whopping 20% attack rating boost, what it is most well known for and why it didn't get more boosts is because they gave it a chance to cast amplified damage, making it an exceptionally great tool for pure physical builds to break through immunes consistently and reliably. I love it, but it's only going to be used on very specific builds. Another good but underappreciated amulet is the Rising Sun, or basically what happens if you took Nokazan's fire theme to heart. Packing a meteor when hit, fire damage, fire absorb, and replenish life, the Rising Sun is most known for its +2 fire skills that do indeed function just like the plus skills on Mage Fists and Leaf, giving bonuses not only to the Sorceress fire tree, but also to things like Holy Fire on the Paladin, Corpse Explosion on the Necro, Armageddon on the Druid, and a ton of other similar skills. Is it best in slot? No, but is it fun? Absolutely, at least on some of the more weird and eccentric builds. Now we reach Seraph's Hymn, an interesting amulet that I can see the use of but rarely use myself. It's got +2 all skills and +2 defensive auras, as well as boosts for dealing with demons and undead, which makes it a fairly good amulet if you have all of your speed and defensive bases covered and you just want an easier time against, well, undead and demons. That said, this amulet has another rather odd distinction though, and that is how it is the only amulet that has a guaranteed sprite, the Sunburst face. It's not distinct since other amulets can have that sprite, but it is the only one that, regardless of how it looks unidentified, will always become that sprite when identified. After that, we move on to the home stretch with amulets you should probably know by heart, starting with High Lord's Wrath. One of only 2 amulets with increased attack speed, it also packs plenty of other really good mods like plus skills, lightning resist, even a scaling chance of deadly strike. A good amulet for most martial builds that need attack speed and deal physical damage. It's a hard one to beat in quite a few builds out of some very good rare or crafted amulets. Next is probably the most well-known of these last 3, and that is Mara's Kaleidoscope, or maybe I should call it Kali-Idoscopy just to make people twitchy. But the reality is that it's probably the most generic definition of good in the game. It has plus skills, plus attributes, and plus all resists. That's it. Period, nothing else. It's just a really good amulet for whenever you don't know what amulet to wear, but can almost always be improved on by a good rare or crafted plus skills amulet. That said, for its level requirement, it's still good, and it is one that I will just dump on characters if I need that plus all skills and just some resists. Last, and far from least, is the highest level requirement unique amulet in the game, and that is Metal Grid, with some charges you'll never use, but also all resist, plus defense, plus attack rating. At first it may not seem useful, but this is actually one of the equipment options people use to help improve their chances against things like Ubers. Personally, it's not my favorite, but it is still a lot better than it looks at first glance. Its rarity carries with it a bit of intrinsic values, since it can't drop very many places, but it's still just a good amulet that may just be a little bit harder to find than some of these others. And that's unique amulets. Do you have a favorite, or do you prefer sticking with just crafted and rare amulets? Mention your favorites down below, and here's a special thanks to the channel members, patrons, and active viewers who make all of this content possible. In Diablo 2, there are a lot of unique items, ranging from amazing to terrible. Today's subject for our game manual series, the unique rings, are no exception. So today we'll look at the rings you'll almost never use and the rings that you'll almost always want a few of, and why they're good or bad. Starting out, we'll look at a ring that will get you very little other than a memeish nice for the level requirement, and that is Nature's Peace. While quirky and weird, I'm usually disappointed when I see this unique ring in my inventory. While it offers a couple perks that you won't find on any other ring, with Rest in Peace and Prevent Monster Heal, these can be found much easier on other gear if you really need them, and in and of themselves aren't terribly useful mods. The rest of the features of this ring also leave a lot to be desired with a common resist and poison resist, low damage reduction, and a low level summon charge. I've honestly yet to find a single build that really has a use for this unfortunate ring. Next up in the unique rings, we get into the rarely used but can be useful group, starting with Dwarf Star, which doesn't get much love sadly. While nothing to write home about, it does give a bit of life and magic damage reduction and a really solid boost to gold find, 100%, which is super high for a ring. It also gives a fairly decent fire absorb percent, which can be helpful against some of the nastier Inferno using enemies, as well as Diablo's fire attacks, and even, yes, the Council's fire hydras. After that, we have Carrion Wind. While not well loved by most people, it does have a soft spot in my heart for just being kind of fun to play around with for at least fast attacking characters. And it's in that kind of weird place of more useful than people think, but less useful than people want. In the mundane front, it has some solid life leech for a ring of its level, it has some okay survivability perks, and the damage to mana is nice for cheaper melee attackers. The trait that makes this kind of fun, though, is the chance to cast Twister on striking, which is specifically fun on a character like a Zealot or a Frenzy Barb, since it can give them an intermittent stun on nearby enemies while fighting, and the Poison Nova can prevent enemies from healing for a couple seconds. Do either of these make it amazing? No, but do they make it fun? Yes, and I try to sneak this into builds whenever possible for my own kind of nerdy pleasure. Last on the rarely used group, and I only put it here because it's usually only used at low levels, is Mantled Heal. It's a simple mana leech ring with replenished life and mana regen boosts. It's good for its level requirement, but by the time you get into late Nightmare in Hell, it generally gets beaten even by basic rare resist rings to boost your survivability. That said, it's pretty good to plonk on your character if you're running a Malice build in normal or other similar kind of like weird builds. The next group is going to be the Magic Find options, which I kind of put in their own category because they're usually fairly sought after even if their bonuses aren't terribly amazing. At the bottom of the list, but most well known, is Nagel Ring. It has a variable amount of Magic Find, but as usual, the higher the better. It also has a couple good mods for how low level the requirement is, which is an okay attack rating boost for the level, some magic damage reduction, as well as damage return. I will sometimes use them so long as it doesn't slow me down, but usually I will prefer a different ring if I'm doing something a little bit more dangerous. The other Magic Find ring is extremely uncommon due to its high level requirement to drop, and that is Wisp Projector, a confusing looking ring that actually has some special uses once you get past its odd list of charges and casting lightning on striking, and that is that it's a lightning absorb ring with Magic Find. This is key because it makes going through gloam-dense areas such as Worldstone Keep and Hell difficulty a bit easier, along with giving you a pinch of Magic Find. Though it is very niche, since outside of this use, there's not much justification to equip it over a better ring. This brings us to the rings that you see used a lot in-game, not just for niche builds or tasks, but where at least a few are going to be in the late-game multiplayer sessions you're in. First up is Ravenfrost, an all-around good ring with attack rating, dexterity, and cannot be frozen being its main selling points, but also packing some cold absorb and cold damage for some fun on the side. It's overall a fairly solid ring, even if you get some of the lower rolls on the bonuses, and that cannot be frozen is super important for, well, characters that require attack speed as one of their major things, because chill can really ruin their day. Next up, we have Bolcathos' Wedding Band, plus skills, life leech, and a variable life boost based on level. It's decent, though it does have a fairly high level requirement compared to the other plus skill ring. It is still pretty distinct for having that plus skill, since that is only available on unique rings. This is a fairly decent skill ring if you need extra life instead of mana, or if you're running a melee caster hybrid build of some sort that would actually get something out of the life leech and plus skills at the same time, though it usually does play second fiddle to the grandfather of plus skill rings, Stone of Jordan. Speaking of Stone of Jordan, which is usually referred to as SOJ, is the original skill ring that was one of the most duped items in the original game, and for good reason. Plus skills, a significant boost of mana, though it has actually like lightning damage that feels like a bit of an afterthought. This ring was even so popular at a point that it was the de facto currency on Battle.net, only later to be replaced with runes. While not too useful for your melee characters, having a couple of these in storage is going to make your casters very, very happy. So what's your favorite unique ring in the game? Do you prefer rares or some of the set combinations? Mention them down below, and a special thanks to the patrons, channel members, and viewers for making these videos possible. In Diablo 2, most of the unique items you will find will be things your character wears, but if you're exceptionally lucky, or in the case of some of these items, able to farm certain enemies, you can gain access to different types of uniques. So today we're going to cover those, namely the 8 unique jewels and the 3 unique charms. Starting with the most popular, the unique charms, we have the only 2 non-quest uniques that require killing a specific enemy to find, with the first being the small charm Annihilus, commonly called Annie. This charm gives you plus to all skills, as well as a decent but variable chunk of attributes, resistances, and even bonus experience gain, and is often considered standard gear for most truly post-game builds. The way you get this is by slaying Uber Diablo, a heavily modified version of the normal Diablo that spawns only in Hell difficulty games after its conditions have been met. For single player, this is selling a singular Stone of Jordan while you're in Hell difficulty. For online, this occurs after a certain number of Stones of Jordan have been sold on a given server. After this condition has been met, he will spawn at the next super unique location you trigger, so be prepared to fight a rather tough boss. Similarly, we have the Hellfire Torch, the result of the Pandemonium event, a challenge that you have much more control of, with +3 to a specific class's skills as well as a variable boost to stats and resistances. It is highly sought after and is sometimes a source of confusion among new players since it triggers Diablo's Firestorm on striking, which can be unexpected if you don't know about this item. Now to get this, you must kill Uber Mephisto, Baal, and Diablo in the Uber Tristram dungeon as part of the Pandemonium event, which frankly deserves a guide in and of itself, but the short version is you farm keys from the Countess, the Summoner, and Neelathak, and then you use those keys to open portals to the 3 Uber dungeons, where you destroy upgraded versions of Andariel, Duriel, and Iswal, to get the items you need access to Uber Tristram. Now, those organs are quite a journey to get in themselves, but overall the entire thing is just going to take a very long time, but it is well worth it in the end, provided you're lucky enough to get the torch flavor you need for the class you need. The last of the unique charms is thankfully far less convoluted to find, but does require a lot more luck since it is just a random drop like any other unique, and that is Geed's Fortune, the fairly well-known but overshadowed magic find grand charm that is also used extensively for gambling in the late game thanks to the vendor price reduction, and it's pretty handy while you're still farming uniques and sets for your characters. Moving on to the jewels, they all share one name, Rainbow Facet, and as you can guess, can be any color available to normal jewels, so don't count on them matching. It's also worth noting they can only spawn exceptionally late in the game, leading to their additional rarity, with the most common farming locations for them being, well, Hell Travancore, Chaos Sanctuary, and sometimes Worldstone Keep is another common farming one if you have a build for it, though they can drop in any high-level area if you're lucky enough to get a jewel drop that turns unique. These jewels come in 2 flavors and 4 elements, but all share the same basic design principle: a trigger effect, a raw elemental bit of damage, plus 2 element skill damage, and a minus to enemy element resist. As you can see with this lightning charm, which is of the death flavor, it gives a 100% chance to cast chain lightning when you die, a chunk of lightning damage, and the plus damage and minus resist for lightning. It's all one flavor. It functions much like the Sorceress Masteries do as far as how the mechanics go. And of course, each of the other elements have similar death effects, with cold giving you level 37 blizzard when you die, fire giving you a level 31 meteor when you die, poison giving you a level 51 poison nova when you die, and of course all the other standard effects, though as you may have noticed, the percents do vary, so obviously people will prefer the perfect 5/5s, but they're all perfectly usable, especially if you're doing solo self-found and just want to use something nice. The other common flavor is the level up variant of each jewel, whose stats are mostly identical, but instead of an on-death effect, they give you a level up effect. For example, lightning gives you a level 41 nova, while cold gives you a similar frost nova, but fire and poison give you a more lasting effect, with fire giving you a level 29 blaze on level up, and poison giving you a level 23 venom. Individually, they're not exceptionally potent, but when combined with the right builds, they give significantly more punch and are a lot more useful than they first appear. Though that said, they are exceptionally rare and will end up locking a piece of equipment into being mostly useful only to one element of build, but they're still very nice to have around for that element of build. So despite being limited, these special uniques are still quite useful and powerful, and I really hope that with the development of Resurrected, they hopefully will add more, but only time will tell if that comes true. That said, if you could add some unique charms and or jewels, what would they be and what needs would they fill? Mention them down below and they might actually make their way into a suggestion video I have planned. And as always, thanks for the support and keep gaming, have fun, and peace out. In Diablo 2, the unique boot selection is pretty interesting, often beating out all but the best rare items outside of specific use cases thanks to the number of traits truly unique to this category of items. They're also interesting in that outside of paladins and their shields, boots are the only other item with a hidden damage value only available to one class, in this case, assassins, which is why we chose this character specifically to show them off. Starting out in normal items, the damage is not super impressive, but there are still some fun things here, starting with Hotspur, which at first glance may seem mostly uninteresting until it's considered that it's an extremely easy way to beeline for 90% resist all, thanks to a base 45% fire resist and a whopping 15% boost to maximum fire resist, which can be quite appealing in a few situations. Other than that, the stats are kind of bland, with just a minor boost to fire damage, life, and defense, and a little more than a short sword's worth of base damage for a boot. Next up is Gorefoot, one of the most forgotten boots in the game, but funnily enough, not that bad of an early option for Mana Leech if you don't have any resist boots. This is because it packs OK Run Walk, Mana Leech as we said, and some other minor stats, but it also provides a couple points into Leap, which can be fun for certain silly Barbarian builds used for hurting packs of enemies. Though unfortunately this Leap is class specific, so it won't ever have any real infamy on other classes. After that are some boots that I find way too often for how rarely I use them, and that is Treads of Chthon. A bit faster run walk than Gorefoot and a number of defensive boosts, and early on the stamina use reduction can be useful, but later it generally does not matter. The kick damage isn't super impressive either, unfortunately, so you usually won't ever really use these long term, but rather just for low level functions. But the next pair of boots are sometimes even used in endgame budget builds, thankfully, and that is Goblin Toe. While most of its stats are fairly mundane with defensive boosts and pinches of damage reduction, the reason it's used so often is probably pretty obvious while looking at it. That is 25% Crushing Blow. So 1 in 4 hits dealing a % damage to the target, and this works with most physical attacks. So a lot of martial classes love these boots early, even sometimes using them as a precursor to a pair of boots we'll cover later. As far as kicks, damage still is not super impressive, but with Crushing Blow, you generally don't need it to be, and later on you can upgrade these to battle boots or even mirrored boots to make up for that. Next are the sadly underused boots, Tear Haunches. This is mostly because you can get similar functionality out of a good set of rares, since the main draw of this pair of boots is the resistances, well, more precisely the resist all, with the minor draws being the stat boosts and faster run walk. Though as a paladin, the free levels in vigor can be useful from time to time for getting through the game or evading enemies quicker. Thankfully, with how common they are, they do seem to still see use in solo self-found runs, just enough to keep them on the average player's mind. After that, we move into the exceptionals, starting with Inferno Stride, which is pretty much just Hotspur's big brother. And while it does not give as much fire resist, the other stats as well as the base kick damage more than make up for it, since it packs more fire damage, more defensive boosts, as well as faster run walk and a chance to cast Blaze when struck. It is also not an uncommon pick for gold find since it packs a reasonable amount of that on top of these mods. Next, we have Water Walks, a pair of boots that has come and gone in popularity from time to time, but in general is just a decent pair of boots, with faster run walk, good defensive mods, and a small boost to max fire resist, not to mention some life and a decent dexterity boost. It's not going to win any big awards, but it's also not a bad pair of boots to just slap on and use until you find a GG rare or a better unique. And thanks to being a higher static plus life, it does get a reasonable boost from any % increases to life you have, which is uncommon in boots. A little less uncommon, thanks to crafting, are mana boots, which is one of the few reasons why Silkweave is a little less popular than it could be. But it's still not a terrible set of boots with faster run walk, okay defensive boosts, and a solid increase in maximum mana. And thanks to the mana per kill, it can still be a good choice for characters that kill swarms of enemies quickly in places like cows or Flayer Jungle. Though far more frequently used is one of the most popular boots in the game, War Travelers. Mostly used and known for their magic find, there's actually a ton of other really powerful perks on these boots, with faster run walk, strength and vitality boosts, as well as an often unmentioned 15 to 25 damage boost, which functions basically on the same as the plus minimum and maximum damage from anything else, which can boost a lot more attacks than you would expect, and is useful for a lot of mainline as well as exotic builds. Last up in the exceptionals is another super popular pair of boots, Gore Riders, which are essentially Goblin Toe's big brother, except giving up a little bit of Crushing Blow in exchange for faster run walk, as well as adding in Deadly Strike and open wound chances, making them exceptionally useful against things like Ubers, where Bleed is super helpful for preventing their healing, and Deadly Strike is useful for stripping off that last little bit of health that Crushing Blow struggles with. Finally, we move into the elites with a pair of boots most people prefer to have as ethereal, and that is Sandstorm Trek, which are auto repair boots with fairly standard boosts to faster run walk, a bit of strength and vitality, as well as a really nice amount of poison resist. Not to mention being one of the few boots with faster hit recovery, making them really nice in preventing reaction locks. After that are rather infamous boots to older players that kind of lost their exploit in an earlier patch, and those are Marowaks. On their baseline, they give faster run walk, decent strength and dexterity, a bump to skeleton mastery, and a few other really nice perks. Though despite being okay boots, they're still mostly well known for an old but fixed bug that allowed you to treat charged items as hard skill points for synergies, which made them absolutely busted for bone necromancers, though you'll only find that in very limited ranges of old patches in Lord of Destruction and never in Resurrected. And the last boots of the Uniques, at least, are the Assassin boots that still sometimes get beat out by upgrades to other boots, unfortunately, and those are Shadow Dancers, with plus Shadow Disciplines, faster run walk, faster hit recovery, which is kind of good, and a solid bump on dexterity, and a high boot damage to go with it as well. They're not bad boots at all, they just can't quite compare to, say, upped Gore Riders with that Crushing Blow and Bleed, but they are still kind of nice to have around if you tend to kind of split between kicks and shadow skills. Overall, there's a few boots that can beat the Uniques outside of endgame rares, but with some of the upcoming changes in 2.4, we may see that change, though it would need to be some major upgrades to beat out the current frontrunners. In Diablo 2, Uniques can provide a lot of interesting perks not otherwise available in their slots, or even available on items period. Belts are actually an extremely good example of this, being an unexpected source of everything from increased attack speed to piercing attacks, which are impossible to get on any of their magic or even rare counterparts. And you'll see this in a lot of unique accessory slots as well, so definitely stay tuned for those videos too. But today we're going to dive into belts and give you an idea of which ones you might want to be looking at for your next build. Starting out, we'll do the normal belts, which are a special case since they're the only belts with varying amounts of slots, so the utility of upgrading them even to just exceptional, if you like their bonuses, is not a bad idea, since it will upgrade them to the maximum capacity of a 4x4 belt at the same time. And while you could also upgrade them further for just defense, it's nowhere near as big of a value addition. That out of the way, we have Lenimo, the unique sash that most players don't ever actually find because of its low Q level, but overall it's actually not a bad belt, with 5% resist all and some mana perks at level 7. It is something you might find yourself using as an early mage, though in the long run you will find belts that provide much more palpable bonuses regardless of your class, so I'd put off upgrading this belt and instead spend it on one of the later normal belts. Next, we have Snake Court, a rather unimpressive belt with a pinch of poison damage and replenished life, but it can prove to be quite useful if you happen to stumble across it before going to face, say, Andariel, because of the exceptional boost to poison resist as well as poison length reduction. While, like Lenimo, it won't be a long-term belt in the early game, it can make a pretty big difference at this stage. After that, we start moving into the more useful belts that actually can be upgraded for later use, even in Nightmare difficulty. Starting with Night Smoke. While not overwhelmingly great, it actually packs some useful stats for low-level characters. With 10% resist all and the damage goes to mana effect, the resists help keep you alive while the damage goes to mana is useful for characters like melee paladins, druids, and barbarians that use lower mana cost skills and get hit a lot, since any damage they take goes towards filling up their mana bubble with this, letting them continue the fight much longer. This belt naturally is only a 3x4 belt, meaning you'll miss out on one row of potions if you don't upgrade it. After that, we actually probably have the most popular belt to upgrade from its natural 3x4 setup, and that is Gold Wrap. While mostly thought of as a Magic Find belt thanks to its natural 30% Magic Find, it also has reasonable defense and Gold Find, but what most people forget is that it is one of the few belts that has increased attack speed, which can help you reach higher breakpoints on a number of builds without resorting to the more expensive alternatives. When upgraded to a battle belt, it does get a pinch more defense, but will allow you to get the desired 4 rows of potions instead of just 3, effectively removing the penalty of being a normal difficulty belt. Lastly in normal, we have Blade Buckle, the only normal unique that is naturally 4x4 potion slots. and also one of the underestimated belts in the game with good defense, a decent bump to dexterity and strength for the level, and faster hit recovery, plus a few other minor mods. It's actually quite a beast of a belt for builds that are in the thick of fighting. A lot of people often forget about hit recovery and its importance in not being reaction locked when surrounded by, say, flayers or frenzy tors that hit really fast. This belt can help with that, especially when playing one of the classes with slower recovery animations. In the exceptional slots, we have several extremely popular belt options. Probably one of the more well-known ones is String of Ears, made popular because of its fairly decent percent damage reduction paired with life leech and a reasonable amount of magic damage reduction, making it one of the better belts for melee characters looking for survival boosts against physical damage. Weirdly, I use it a lot more in earlier patches, but generally I find myself favoring the bigger impact alternatives in my builds, since most of these functions you can get elsewhere pretty easily. Next is a fairly strong belt for ranged characters, and that is Razortail, mostly known for its 33% chance of piercing attacks, which functions pretty much like a similar percent of the Amazon skill, and is useful for a lot of Amazon builds as well as non-Amazon builds. As an Amazon, this combines with your passive skill exceptionally well. Another factor often ignored about this belt is the fact that it gives a solid boost to dexterity, as well as being one of the few belts with a hard increase to damage, which can actually provide a decent bonus to your damage output, especially if you have percents boosting it after this. The last thing of note is how the attacker takes damage function scales, making it an actually functional amount of retaliation damage at higher levels. After that, we have a slightly less used belt, Gloom's Trap, a mediocre belt because it doesn't really fit too many builds and it is a bit conflicted on who it's built for, but it's best to think of it as a mana belt with vitality, since it gives a bump to maximum mana, a boost to mana regen, and mana leech. Sometimes you'll find this builds on things like mage zons, but usually even with those, you'll want to opt for a piercing effect of Razortail instead to take advantage of your exploding kind of functions of your arrows. But this can be used in a number of mana-hungry builds that deliver attack damage as a holdover for your endgame builds, though this is also one of the key items for zero light radius setups, but that's more of a gimmick, I guess. Next we have Snow Clash, the Blizzard belt, and it can actually boost up your blizzard damage quite a bit. Generally speaking, it can be a bit of a trap though, since if you have another belt that we'll see in a minute, you're usually giving up casting frames and a point in a few other skills for that slightly bit stronger blizzard, which can be good or bad depending on the rest of your build. For non-sorceresses, it's a bit better to think of it like a slightly weaker Thunder God's Vigor, but for cold, basically. It essentially makes you insanely tanky against cold damage if your resists are up to snuff at least. It gives you the plus skills it mentions, and it gives you cold damage both on attacks and randomly when you're struck. If the percent was a bit higher on that last part, there would be a few more uses for this, but as it stands, it's just okay for non-sorceresses, and pretty much just used exclusively on pure Blizzard sorceresses. Speaking of Thunder God's Vigor though, that's what's next. With packed in lightning damage, maximum resist boost, and absorb, you can kind of see the theme quite well. It also sneaks in some points in strength and vitality, which can be handy, and even some plus skills for Lightning Fury and Lightning Strike, which can be useful for the Javazon. Generally speaking, for most classes, this is an easily gotten solution to the Gloam issue in World's Own Keep, at least for those that run that area, since it allows you to absorb a bit of their damage and have much better resistances against the rest of it. Probably one of my favorite belts that doesn't get brought up nearly as much as it used to. After that, we move into the elites and start with the belt I was alluding to with Snow Clash, and that is Arachnid's Mesh. The belt I use way too often, mainly because it's the only belt with plus all skills, and it packs more faster cast rate than any crafted belt can, making it pretty much the go-to for any class that is spell-driven, like the Necromancer or Sorceress. It is also useful for Enigma-using characters since it can help combat the slow teleport curse that a lot of classes have whenever they have really slow faster cast rate. The other bonuses on this belt are pretty negligible, with some mana boost and slow target being on there, but classes that use it generally won't have to use it for slow target. The venom charges also almost always go unused, but they can be used for an interesting trick for poison dagger necromancers for those that have done their research on how poison and durations function. Next, we have the other attack speed unique belt, and that is Nosferatu's Coil, probably one of my favorite belts in the game, oddly enough, with 10% increased attack speed, life leech, a bit of slows target, and a chunky amount of strength and a bit of mana per kill. It's a decent all-round belt for characters that use attack skills. Sure, it doesn't have damage reduction, but the rest of its abilities really make up for that, only really being opted out of with builds that don't need that extra little bit of attack speed or slow target. Lastly, we have Verdungo's Hearty Cord, which I constantly think about personalizing because I find named items a bit weird for that, but either way, this is just a generic good belt for the most part, but does pull a role similar to String of Ears with variable damage reduction, but this packs faster hit recovery, decent replenish life, and vitality on it instead of life leech and magic damage reduction. You'll often find me slipping this belt on builds that need to reach the next hit recovery breakpoint and can use the damage reduction, since it basically comes in hitting a nice mix of traits for most characters in the fray. And that's the unique belts. Stay tuned for the set ones in the near future, since they actually provide some decent competition to these, and as always, a special thanks to channel patrons, members, and viewers that make this content possible. There's a lot of uniques in Diablo 2, so with this video the goal is to give you a hand in understanding your unique glove options in the game, since while often underappreciated, there are a lot of really fun options to be had in these fairly varied uniques. As usual, we'll start off in the normal gloves with the Hand of Brock, an interesting source of low-level dual leech, which early on you'll be lucky if you can kind of maintain Zeal with it, but as you get more damaging gear, it can actually be fairly decent for sustaining your low mana skills. Only reason this does not really see a lot of late game use is that while it is an okay pair of gloves, it lacks any of the desired GG stats for the end game, but for just going through, it's not a bad option to keep around if you happen to find it. Next is Blood Fist, an often underestimated pair of gloves that gets a bit of a reputation in some communities thanks to its level 9 requirement, alongside some fairly nice stats. The highlights being the increased attack speed and faster hit recovery, but the minimum damage boost and extra life are not half bad either. While I only use it on a few builds, the usefulness of the kind of frame savings from this pair of gloves cannot be denied. After that, we have Magic Find gloves, Chance Guards. These are usually about as sought after as Gold Daggers, though a bit less than Gold Wrap, as far as basically low-level magic items go. And it can also be used in some endgame farming situations. There really isn't much use though outside of farming for Chance Guards, unfortunately, but they can get up to some fairly solid amounts of Magic Find and Gold Find on them, making them a fairly decent choice for equipping if you're going through the game and want to find some solid incidental drops. Next, we have one of the more popular gloves used by casters, and that's Mage Fist. Being one of only 2 sources of faster casts on gloves, Mage Fists also pack a nice boost of plus to fire skills and mana regeneration boost to keep things topped off. While most of the rest of its stats are rather underwhelming, these base stats are more than enough to cement this set of gloves as one of the cornerstone pieces of equipment for several endgame builds. The last of the normal uniques is a pair of gloves that have been highly sought after at times, but fallen off a bit with time, especially thanks to the introduction of merchants selling mana potions, and that is Frostburn. With massive increased mana, a pinch of off-weapon enhanced damage, a pinch of cold damage too, they're fairly decent gloves, especially if you nab them on a solo self-found run. And while I rarely use them anymore in endgame builds, they do have quite a few fun uses even in the modern game if you step off the trail of the meta, into the more interesting mid-game kind of builds. Moving into exceptional gloves, we have Venom Grip, which are basically the poor man's blood gloves, with Crushing Blow, Life Leech, and actually reasonable defense for gloves. They also have a bit of a poison theme, with poison damage and resistance perks to help them out. The sad reality, though, is that since blood gloves exist, you can make items that easily beat these out with a similar stats, combined with increased attack speed, because you can get those on crafted gloves, all for the cost of some perfect gems and easily farmable runes. Are these bad? No, but they are easily outclassed with a little bit of work. Next is a pair of gloves that I almost never use, and that is Grave Palm. They are at the point that despite having a few stored, the only ones I kind of bothered to even identify were for this video. To put it nicely, these are your Undead Slayer gloves with a boost to damage and attack rating to undead and a handful of stats. They just don't cut the mustard whenever it comes to regular use though, since there are gloves that do everything these gloves do, but better. For example, our next gloves, the Ghoul Hides, do undead killing with per level boosts that quickly outclass Grave Palm's basic values, at higher levels at the very least, and combine them with Mana Leech and bonus life, so it has utility beyond simply undead slaying. Are these much better? No, but I have actually used these on a few occasions on solo self-found runs, where generally speaking I have yet to find a real use for Grave Palms outside of, well, being just gloves to wear. They're not really an upgrade from even a mediocre set of rares for normal play. After that though, we have a pair of gloves that I love using, much to the pain of a number of viewers, and that is Lava Gout, with 20% increased attack speed, a pinch of fire damage, fire resist, and a chance to auto-cast enchant. These are some of my favorite gloves for physical attackers in the game, mainly because I favor full sweeps with characters like that, where I hit all the farming areas in a row without leaving the game, and this keeps me from having to use demon limbs and such for the attack rating boost of enchant and having to recast it all the time. There are better gloves for quick runs, but these are just fun and consistent for me, and they kind of accentuate my playstyle. Next is a bit more of a gimmicky but still fire-themed pair of gloves called Hellmouth. These unique war gauntlets can be used for a little bit of fun with chance to cast builds to play around with them, though with their percent so low it's not super reliable, especially for the levels of the skills it causes to spawn. Beyond that, these are just decent defense gloves with fire damage and absorb, so nothing too special to write home about, but they can be fun here and there even if they are not super valuable. As we move into the elite gloves, we actually have a situation where all three of the elite items have their specific uses, starting with Dracul's Grasp, easily the most popular of the three thanks to its chance to cast life tap on striking that has been used by a number of builds as a method of getting high amounts of life recovery from their hits, even against undead targets. Beyond this, you also have life per kill, an extremely rare modifier, as well as plus strength, natural life leech, and open wounds, which puts these in the upper list of gloves for martial characters, even if they don't have increased attack speed. These are really also highly sought after for smiter builds because it allows you to get life back from smiting as well. After that, we have the slightly underappreciated Soul Drainers. While for the most part, these are just the big brothers of the Hands of Brock we looked at earlier with Dual Leech, they actually also have a chance to cast Weaken, which can help out against certain annoying enemies or even help partially mitigate the damage boosts of some enemy auras. While not a best-in-slot option, these can be useful to characters traveling through some of the more dangerous areas with a lot of melee or physical damage enemies. Last on the list are the Steel Rend War Gauntlets, which are fairly offensively designed gauntlets that I passed over a lot after finding them the first time thanks to the high strength requirement. But these gauntlets oddly do have a number of interesting uses thanks to the 10% crushing blow, big strength boost, and a fairly decent off-weapon enhanced damage boost ranging from 30 to 60%, which while not fortitude levels is not a small amount either, which makes these kind of a fairly reasonable tool for high damage loadouts that don't need increased attack speed. And that's the unique gloves. Much like the unique belts, there's a lot of competition between these and their set item counterparts as well as rares in terms of what's best in slot, but it's best not to dismiss the uniques in this slot since there's a ton of good options for almost every type of build that you can only get from these unique items. And a special thanks to all the channel members and patrons that make this content possible. One of the more popular slots for unique items in Diablo 2 is the helmet, and this is because we have a ton of options ranging from simply interesting all the way to best in slot thanks to the unique features available to specific uniques in this space. As usual, let's start out with the normal difficulty uniques, both because it makes sense, but also because there's a number of interesting low-level helmets that may just surprise you. Starting with Biggin's Bonnet, the unique cap, which falls into an interesting category of being one of only a handful of off-weapon enhanced damage sources with a reasonable amount of boost. While not as impactful early on, this can make this particular helmet quite interesting to use, at least as you progress throughout the game and get higher base damage weapons. Beyond that, it also has a few other nice boosts like attack rating, life, and mana, though it is worth noting it does not come with a socket naturally, it's just all of my bonnets are socketed since I only seem to find them on, well, solo self-found runs, and ended up using this one into Nightmare. Next up is Tarn Helm, which used to be one of the most sought-after helmets in the game before Lord of Destruction released, and for obvious reasons. With plus all skills, decent magic find, and gold find, all with only a level 15 requirement, and before that it had no requirement, it's exceptionally nice for a helmet for its level requirement in LOD and Resurrected, even by today's standards, even though its bonus list is fairly short. After that, we have Coif of Glory, the blinding helmet. While not something that's likely to be used into the endgame, Coif of Glory can be an interesting early tool for a number of ranged or even fast attacking characters, thanks to not only the blinding effect mentioned, but also the lightning resist and improved defense against missiles, which can help out in some early areas, but it does get quickly outclassed as you approach the mid-game. Next, we have Dusk Deep, an all-around just good, albeit fairly mundane helmet for the low levels, mostly thanks to the fairly significant 15% resist all, but it also does have a nice pinch of damage reduction as well as a plus maximum damage that can help out quite a bit, at least early on. The latest I've used one of these was into Mid-Nightmare, but it wouldn't be a terrible helmet for solo self-found through Hell if you didn't find anything better, and it didn't need the plus skills from something like Lore. Next up, we grab Howltusk by the Horns. This helmet is interesting for ranged characters, but I find it infuriating for melee characters. And that's because it's pretty much built around keeping things away. With a 25% chance to cause fear, as well as a chance to knock back enemies, it keeps them back. Though it does have some okay bonuses in its minor stats, such as damage taken to mana, which can help you stay topped off mana-wise if you're taking a lot of hits. In a similar vein, we have Face of Horror, with a 50% chance to cause an enemy to flee, but this helmet does see a few more uses than than Haltusk, mostly because a fairly large strength boost as well as a bonus damage to undead and an okay boost to all resists. It's pretty solid helmet if you end up having to go with something like this, like an Insight Bill or on an Act 2 Mercenary in early Nightmare, and need to square up that extra strength while doing what you can to keep enemies off of him. Weirdly, it seems the trend of the end of normal helmets are great mercenary helmets, and Undead Crown is no exception. With Life Leech, Poison Resist, half freeze duration, and buffs against undead, it works out as a fairly solid early mercenary helmet to get you some nice modifiers on all but Act 3 mercenaries. That said, some necromancers have used it in the past for skeleton mastery boosts, but you're usually better off with Lore or our next helm, Wormskull. This is because Wormskull is fairly similar in that it's Life Leech and some poison resist, but it sheds a few of the other modifiers in favor of adding a bit of poison damage, but more importantly a +1 to all necromancer skill levels, which gives you a nice little boost across the board, though unfortunately unlike the old days, this helmet is a little more quick to be outclassed by the other available plus skill helmets across the board, pretty much only beating out Undead Crown. In the exceptional slots, we actually have one of those plus skill helmets that beat it out, and that's Peasant Crown, an oddly underrated helmet with plus all skills, boost to vitality and energy, replenish life, and a rather odd bump to run walk speed that most people forget about on this helmet. There's only a few builds that I'll favor this over Lore on, but it is still a decent helmet for a lot of builds if you already have enough lightning resist elsewhere. After that, we have our first damage reduction helmet, the Rock Stopper. It packs faster hit recovery, decent resist, and damage reduction by %, and is repeatedly ignored by players in spite of its utility as a strong, tanking-centered helmet. While it does lack some desirable helmet traits, if you can fill those gaps elsewhere, this is a fairly reliable mid-level helmet that you can easily beat hell with while using. Speaking of beating hell, we have one of my favorite sleeper helmets, and that is Steel Skull, which, like Biggin's Bonnet, doesn't come with that socket, but it does come with all the rest of these stats. Increased attack speed being super uncommon for helmets, the faster hit recovery being nice, the dual leech being really solid for physical damage dealers like Amazon or Paladin, and it packs a variable magic find % that can be really useful for finding incidental items while going through the game, and the % is competitive with Tarnhelm, and at its peak it's even competitive with Harlequin Crest, which is still about 2 rows away. Next up, we have Darkside Helm, which is kind of like a souped-up Nadir or Coif of Glory, where it's built around robbing the enemy of sight. It packs Cloak of Shadows charges, as well as a chance to cast Dim Vision, which is the area effect of the blind spell when struck. On top of that, it also packs a bit of fire resist, cannot be frozen, and mana leech, all of which are desirable traits, and it gets a pinch of defense boost every level to help you keep from getting hit as much. I rarely find it when I need it, but it is still a really solid mid-level helmet that, if you should find it, one character who needs a bit of mana leech and needs a little extra protection, it can be really nice. After that, we have the Amazon helmet, Valkyrie Wing, which gives us Amazon skill levels, faster run walk, faster hit recovery, and mana per kill. While not necessarily best in slot for most Amazon builds, there's still quite a few that can get some decent utility out of each of these abilities, and is also, funnily enough, one of the helmets that falsely gets my hopes up a lot because I always forget if winged helms or spired helms are elite. Now we have one of my guilty pleasure helmets, Blackhorn's Face. I find sick pleasure in combining this with Razor Tine on a mercenary to reach the slow target cap when he stabs enemies. Even though it's not super effective, it is just kind of fun. This helmet does have other nice features though, such as lightning resist and absorb, retaliatory lightning damage, and prevent monster heal, which can actually make it useful on a number of characters while you're working towards something better. Though, speaking of mercenary helmets, Crown of Thieves is actually one of the go-to helmets in the mid-game thanks to its massive life leech for a helmet, combined with solid dexterity and life boosts, not to mention a dab of fire resist as well. And if your mercenary gets the final hit, you can even count on a bit of extra gold. Is it best in slot? God no, but it's a solid life leech helmet that can just get the job done when you need the job done. Though in terms of life leech helms, very few can compete with our next helmet, the infamous Vampire Gaze, with all of its varied abbreviations. It's still just a really solid helmet, packing dual leech, cold damage to slow down enemies of course, decent defense, solid damage reduction %, and even a flat magic damage reduction that helps far more than you'd think. This used to be the go-to helmet for a lot of characters, but after a few changes to the game mechanics, it has fallen just a little bit behind, but it is still really freaking good rather than godly like it used to be. Now we move on to the elites, starting with probably the most infamous of the pack, commonly just called Shaco. The Harlequin Crest lives up to its reputation as far as Magic Find helmets goes, thanks to +2 all skills and +2 to all attributes, a scaling life and mana boost, as well as a % damage reduction, all paired with Magic Find. While more specialist helmets can easily win out on specific builds, this is just the most reliable helmet for many builds to go for and packs with it a lot of magic find, which tends to result in people flocking to it for farming gear, even if something else is stronger. While I would love to segue into one of the stronger helmets, we've got two stinkers to get out of the way first, starting with Steel Shade. It's a Mana Leech Replenish Life Fire Absorb helmet that requires a ton of strength and level 62, that I would honestly rather use lore than in many cases, since I can get that Mana Leech elsewhere with better mods attached, and I have honestly never bothered equipping this one on a character outside of desperation or wanting to stand in a firewall. The second disappointment, which thankfully is not as disappointing except that it gets your hopes up, is Veil of Steel. Pretty much just used for stat boosts and fairly respectable resists. It doesn't really pack too many things that are interesting, but maybe I'll get around to making a Man of Steel build that uses it for meme reasons, but it, like Steel Shade, just doesn't really get much of any use for me outside of true desperation. Though, as we promised, there are stronger helms, and the other unique-spired helm is not a disappointment, and that is Nightwing's Veil. Plus 2 all skills, boosted cold damage plus dexterity, cold absorb, half freeze duration, and a massive reduction in strength requirements to equip makes this a really nice helmet for a cold damage dealer. Especially the cold sorceress, since she already pierces resist, making that plus cold damage go the extra mile. The plus skills on it help a ton too and can be used by any class, and I've used these on a number of builds, though slip it on a Blizzard or Orb Sorceress and you will not be disappointed. Next is probably the most popular mercenary helmet, or at least the most desirable, and that is Andariel's Visage. Another plus all skills helmet, but this time with increased attack speed, life leech strength, and poison perks in several respects. The only reason I generally leave this on the sidelines is you pretty much have to be using something to compensate for the loss of fire resist if you're using this whether on a mercenary or a player, because that's a pretty hefty chunk. The most popular being a Ruby Jewel of Fervor to boost attack speed more while overcoming the fire resistance, not to be confused with the other Ruby Jewel of Fervor that boosts damage with attack speed. I like it, but outside of a couple builds, I generally don't use it on mercenaries too often anymore due to the areas I run, namely Travancore, Chaos Sanctuary, and the Bale Waves where fire will wreck your shit. Next is an often adored helmet that is actually kind of hard to find and super stat hungry, and that is Crown of Ages. Packing plus all skills, faster hit recovery, resist all, and a % damage reduction, along with natural open sockets, it can be a nasty helmet in the right hands, especially if you find great items for those sockets. While I rarely recommend this helmet on builds, outside of certain meme builds, it is a really strong option if you have the strength and setup to support it, and the need to be in the thick of things thanks to its massive flexibility and survivability perks. The last normal elite helm before we get to the circlets is Giant Skull, a rather special helmet that doesn't look like it should be at first, but thanks to being a source of crushing blow, with knockback, and a boost to strength along with reasonable stat requirements, and open sockets, this helmet is just as flexible as Crown of Ages, and one of my favorite sleeper helmets for Act 1 mercenaries as well as Boazons, letting it do a lot more than it seems like it should at first glance. Also, it just looks cooler than the other bone helmets because, well, Resurrected decided to make the other ones floppier. On the circlet front, we have two helmets. First, Kira's Guardian, with faster hit recovery, cannot be frozen, and massive resist boosts. If you throw a socket in it, it can actually be really nice to use for a number of characters. It will almost never be the ideal helmet or best in slot, but it's also just really good at providing resist when you need it if you can't think of a better helmet. Though by the time you find it, you'll usually have found something better for each given build. You could still use this for covering those resistance gaps. And last, and way far from least, is Griffin's Eye, really sought after helmet, and at first it may look like it's solely for lightning characters, and to an extent you would be right, but with plus all skills, 25% faster cast rate, all in addition to really strong lightning perks, it can be useful to a lot of spell spamming builds, even if they don't use that lightning aspect of it. Though to see it really shine, throw it in a Javazon, Lightning Sorceress, or Holy Shock Paladin that does not use Dream, and it will be quite surprising in its potency. In Diablo 2, there's a metric ton of unique armors, some more useful than others, but most of them actually having uses for in-game progression, and a couple of them even being strong endgame options. Obviously, runewords cause a number of these to be acknowledged less, but the functionality of even the low armors is a lot more than people often give them credit for. Starting out in normal armors, we're going to hit the ground running with Grey Form, a unique in the same vein as Rixet's Keen in that it's a potent, low-level option for most players, and most players don't even realize it exists. It packs 5% life leech, solid cold and fire resist, and a dexterity bump, alongside a few other mods. It's actually a really nice early armor, especially considering its level 7 requirement. While it lacks much in upgradability, this armor can tide you over for quite a while. Next up is Blinkbat's Form, a little more disappointing, but still fun. It slips in faster run walk, hit recovery, and a pinch of minor perks. While I generally wouldn't use it over a Grey Form, it's still not bad for early armor for yourself or your mercenary until you can get into some of the early runeword options. After that is the Centurion. In a similar vein to Blinkbats, it generally doesn't outperform other normal unique armors, but it's still not bad, especially if you're using a Malice, since it packs Replenish Life, attack rating, and a bit of mana, life, and damage reduction to kinda help you out. Not to mention, it does help out with stamina issues you'll sometimes have early on. That said, the sleeper of the early normal armors is probably Twitch Throw, since it's a fairly solid competitor for stealth on a number of builds. Since while it lacks the desired run walk speed, it does pack in two features that are exceptionally hard to find, at least in this slot: increased attack speed and increased chance of blocking, along with bigger stat boost than stealth. Is it going to beat it out for speedrunning? No, but it will provide you a lot easier time for several martial builds. Up till now, all of our armors have been light armors, meaning they won't drop your movement speed or stamina. But with Dark Glow, we have our first medium armor, so the question becomes, is it worth the movement speed penalty? And in some cases, it would be, though generally only if you're using transferred in gear, since its main perk is raising your maximum resist by 5% across the board, letting you reach up to 80% total resist. It does pack 10% resist of its own, but usually you won't be getting enough resist from gear to max it out until late normal, unless you're very lucky or doing a lot of crafting or gambling, or as we said, transferred items on. And immediately after that, we get our first heavy armor, Hawkmail. One of a few early sources of Cannot Be Frozen, it also packs a bump to cold resist, as well as raising the cap on cold resist a whopping 15%, letting you reach 90% cold resist as your new max. In addition to these cold-themed perks, it does sneak in a little faster run walk speed to help mitigate the heavy armor penalty that people would often try to avoid. Back into the light armor, we have Venom Ward, easily the most common unique in the game due to being a breastplate. It's basically just the Hawkmail of poison, but with a much bigger boost to resists, basically pushing you a guaranteed 90% poison resist thanks to the plus maximum as well. This, along with the poison length reduction, actually make it a fairly good early mercenary armor too, to keep them from getting quite as wrecked from early poison sources, though you will end up swapping it out as you get further into the game. Another medium armor on the list is Sparking Mail, which has a strange Mandela effect for me because I always thought it was Sparkling Mail for ages, but generally I only ever use this armor in normal difficulty if I'm hurting on lightning resists, but it's very quick to get swapped out since it doesn't really pack too many unique or exceptional features compared to pretty much any other armor we can get in similar areas, though admittedly, yes, that lightning resist is actually kind of nice. Now, onto an early source of freeze target, we have Ice Blink, a medium armor with obvious cold themes. It slips us that freeze target as I mentioned, alongside cold resist and a little magic reduction. Much like Sparking Mail, it does not provide me with too much in the way of utility outside of very specific builds or needs, and will often get replaced as I move into late normal or early nightmare, and honestly usually does not even win out over the much more accessible stealth. After that, we go back to the light armors with Heavenly Garb, a nice enough light plate with some interesting but confused mods, packing Resist All to help everyone out, but splitting itself between martial classes favor with perks against undead, and casters with perks to energy. It's good armor, and I'll use it if I find it, but it has definitely lost its shine compared to its uses in the early days of Diablo 2. Next is the medium armor Rock Fleece, one of a number of sleeper armors. Rock Fleece makes exceptionally nice early mercenary or melee character armor due to it being a sub 30 source of damage reduction by percent, not to mention a little flat damage reduction to help round it off. This combined with decent defense for the level, as well as plus strength and a bit more forgiving requirements, makes it an armor I'm exceptionally happy to find on solo self-found runs or even in mid-game farming. Back to the heavy boys, we have Bone Flesh, our second Life Leech armor. It also packs open wounds and an attack rating boost, and is another contender for solid mercenary armor since it provides us with the ever desirable Life Leech on the mercenary. That is often necessary to keep him alive in the mid game. While it does lack some perks we'd want for him, this combined with a safety helmet can actually keep him pretty happy for a while. Next we have the armor that I probably have the biggest love-hate relationship with, and that is Rattle Cage, a medium weight armor and an amazing early source of crushing blow, but with one massive drawback that keeps me from using it for most characters, and that is hit causes monsters to flee, which means unless you're ranged, you're going to be chasing most things you encounter. That said, it is great for budget uber killing or boss hunting, since they cannot be giving fear. As we near the end of normal, we have Goldskin, a heavy armor with heavy resist. 35% to be exact. It also packs some extra gold find, which is nice along with retaliation damage. It's not going to be something you carry into the endgame, but provided you can tolerate the slower running speed, it can definitely help you shore up your resists well into Nightmare. Finally, at the end of normal, we have Silks of the Victor, an armor that used to be loved in the old days and is now just somewhat mediocre. It packs +1 to all skills, some mana leech, and decent defense, all in a medium armor. So it may slow you down a bit, but that plus skill is really nice on a number of builds. Though with exceptional competitors now available, it did end up losing a lot of its shine to these new armors. One glaring example as we move into the exceptionals is Spirit Shroud, which is basically just Silks, but better. With plus all skills, replenish life, magic damage reduction, and cannot be frozen, it's a pretty solid mix of bonuses for a character just going through the game. And for some odd reason, I find this armor insanely common, so much so that on a few solo runs, I've actually found multiples of them as I go through the End of Hell. Though one I wish I could find as much as that is Skin of the Viper Magi. This is generally preferred for casters, since it packs plus all skills, faster cast, and a pretty chunky amount of resist all, but I have terrible luck finding it for some reason. They're both light armors, I don't know why, though that's just kind of RNG for you. This is the first armor from this video that you'll actually see on end game builds as best in slot options. Sure, it's no enigma, but the combination of bonuses on this armor truly make it a unique entry, especially for min-maxing a number of builds. After that, we have Skin of the Flayed One, a reasonable life-oriented armor with life leech, replenish life, and retaliation damage. It's good enough, though if you can find an ethereal one, it can provide a fairly decent defensive buff alongside all this thanks to the auto repair function, though generally I find myself just using this as an interim mercenary armor when I find it rather than using it myself. Next is Iron Pelt, an armor that has a few interesting niche uses for tank characters. It may lack percent reduction, but much like certain shields, it packs in a fairly large absolute number damage reduction and magic damage reduction, along with scaling defense bonuses. While there are not a ton of builds that focus on this, a certain damage mitigation build will seek this armor out in the mid game, only then really being beat out by its big brother in the elites. Our first naturally socketed armor is Spirit Forge, a medium armor with an odd mix of natural bonuses ranging from strength and life to a pinch of fire resist and fire damage, coming with a natural 2 sockets, though allows it to be easily adapted to most needs you could have. So it is definitely a flexible find, even if in and of itself, it's only mediocre compared to other options. After that, in the same vein as Twitch Throw, we have Crow Caw, a heavy armor with an increased attack speed, faster hit recovery, open wounds, and dexterity. Though generally, if given the choice between the two, I would generally prefer to settle on Twitch Throw due to more utility, but Crow Caw does have superior defense and that very nice open wound, so they're at least competitive with each other in certain situations. On to a fairly common drop, which is much like its little brother, we have Duriel's Shell, which weirdly enough feels perfectly appropriate for its name. Packing cannot be frozen, solid general resist with a bit of additional bonus to cold, and then plus strength as well as scaling life and defense. It's actually got a solid reliable piece of armor there, and since it's light armor, it will not slow you down. It really does sit in the field of I'd totally use this on my way through hell until I can find something that is in my best in slot. Though speaking of best in slot items, we have Shaft Stop, an armor that has definitely taken a tumble over the years, but is still good despite losing its role as the go-to armor for darn near everyone. It packs a flat 60 life boost, which lets it be boosted by war cries and auras and such, along with 30% damage reduction effects, though with the current cap of 50% damage reduction, it can quickly become redundant with other gear, which is what ultimately led to the downfall of this medium armor. After that, we get to one of the more popular early Magic Find armors at last, and that is Skuldr's Ire. Plus all skills, auto repair, magic damage reduction, and scaling Magic Find makes it a fairly tempting offer for armor that only requires level 42, with the only drawback being its medium weight. It's definitely a no-brainer if you want Magic Find gear in the mid-game, and as a sorceress, you pretty much won't feel any speed difference because you have teleport by then. It used to be more popular, but it is still quite solid. Finally, back to another light armor, we have Kay Hagen's Wisdom, one of the competitors for Skin of the Viper Magi. It packs the same plus skills, but loses a little bit of faster cast rate and the entirety of the resists, but it is able to sneak in an energy boost alongside mana per kill and magic damage reduction, not to mention faster hit recovery, though generally speaking, the people that use this armor generally don't want or need that last feature because you're generally not going to get hit because you're ranged. I like it as armor, though it will almost always fall out of favor for its little blue brother, the Viper Magi. Moving on, we have Tooth Row, a medium armor that causes bleeding, has retaliatory damage, and throws in strength and fire resist to kinda help out. Not to mention, pretty decent defense for an exceptional armor. While I want to like this armor, it does unfortunately come around too late to really be competitive with those stats, though in a pinch, I guess I will use it if I haven't found anything better. After that is one of the best budget armors for the mercenary, and not a terrible armor for the player either. That's the heavy armor Guardian Angel. The reason this is so nice is that it can be used to cap out the mercenary's resistances at 90%, making them orders of magnitude more durable than without it. For the player though, this is one of only 2 armors with increased block chance, and the other one being Twitch Throw, and this can be used just as easily to max out the player resist as well. I usually slap an rune in it regardless and call it a day. Oddly enough, I almost treat the plus paladin skills on this as an afterthought, but it can be a little bit of an extra addition if you're running this on something like a Hammerden. Unfortunately, following that is an armor I almost never find a use for, and that's Atma's Whale, a medium armor that just feels uninspired. It's got a bit of faster hit recovery, plenish life, mana boost, dexterity, and magic find. None in insane proportions. It's not innately bad armor, it's just underwhelming regardless of what situation you're going to use it for. Heck, it's not even a cool purple color like Rattlecage was, so it doesn't even have the fashion perk. Though thankfully we can find something interesting in our next armor, Black Hades. It's a heavy armor, so it will slow you down, but it comes with anti-demon perks, half freeze duration, high defense, but most importantly, 3 sockets, letting you pull off some fun builds with it, none of which are best in slot, but it can provide a lot of fun special setups, and can even be a decent mercenary armor if you find an ethereal one. Is it best in slot? No, but the flexibility in it does make it fun to play with. The last exceptional is one that I've tried making builds for a few times, and that's Corpsemorn. It just can't quite cut it, unfortunately, which is disappointing because it gives serious Dark Knight vibes. Its main claim to fame is the Iron Maiden when struck, and the inclusion of Corpse Explosion charges. Beyond that, it's fairly basic armor with strength, vitality, cold resist, and fire damage. It's not bad, I just wish it was better so I could justify using it for the appearance reasons at the very least. Last up are the elites, and as you can tell, this next one's we've got a few of, and that's Ormus's Robes. With faster cast plus elemental damage and some mana regen, it's an okay caster armor, though its main claim to fame is packing random +3 to a specific sorceress skill. In the case of this one, Chain Lightning, though it can pack any sorceress skill that does not require level 30 to learn, so you'll see it used as a pre-buff armor and stuff like that quite often. Now, we mentioned Iron Pelt's big brother earlier, and here we have it, the Gladiator's Bane. And as you can see, it literally is just an upgraded version of it, with flat damage reduction, both magic and physical, stacked with faster hit recovery, cannot be frozen, and a few other nice perks, not to mention higher defense. It's definitely an underestimated piece of armor, and does have some fun uses for damage mitigation builds. After that, we probably have one of the most well-known armors in the Diablo franchise, Arcane's Valor, which comes with a variable amount of plus skills, faster hit recovery, damage reduction, and a scaling vitality boost. It was a highly sought-after armor before the days of Enigma and Chains of Honor. Now it mostly just sits as an okay armor to find, but that you'll often prefer more specialized uniques or specific rune words for. Back in green, we have Leviathan, another medium armor that just gives you a lot of strength, defense, and damage reduction. It is halfway decent as far as damage reduction armors go, but it suffers the same problem Shaft Stop does in that it's not special enough to justify its usage in today's meta unless you're running a very specific build that can take advantage of that damage reduction on armor. The last heavy armor we have is actually Steel Carapace, which honestly always makes me think of an upgraded Corpseborn that kind of kept all the same problems. Basically, it's an interesting idea to have an Iron Maiden armor, with this one with cold res, faster hit recovery, and auto repair, meaning you can explore high defense ethereal versions, but it never quite stands out enough to really be a main pick. And with higher defense, you're actually pretty much working against triggering the Iron Maiden effect that makes this special. And last up in the armors, we have the two Sacred Armors, the easier to get one being Templar's Might, a massive strength requirement medium armor with offensive aura boost, faster hit recovery, strength and vitality, and some defensive perks. You'd think with how rare Sacred Armors are, much less unique ones, it would stand out more, but unfortunately that's just not the case. It's good enough, but far from best in slot by the time you find it. The other Sacred Armor is Tyrael's Might, indestructible with no stat requirements to equip it. It's at least interesting in that regard. There are some uses for this set of armor, thanks to Rest in Peace and Cannot Be Frozen, along with its decent other stats with bumps to strength, run walk, and demon damage, but they're few and far between. It's a cool armor to keep in your collection, but you'll find you'll only rarely use it, which is disappointing for how rare it is. And no, it unfortunately does not come with that socket, I just have it in there for some odd builds I was trying with it back in the day. So what's your favorite armor to use that is not Enigma? Mention it down below and I might make a build around it if I can come up with one. And as always, a special thanks to the channel members and patrons that help support these videos, and those of you that got all the way to the end, since that helps share it with more people. And as always, keep gaming, have fun, and peace out. This has been Alzorath. Bye. It slices, it dices, it makes julienne fries. Well, not really, but swords are one of the most popular weapon types in Diablo 2 for a variety of reasons, not the least of which the broad number of functions available for this weapon set. Today, we're going to look at the unique swords of Diablo 2, and since it worked so well for the amulets, we're going to go mostly by level requirement, albeit within specific categories, so that every sword gets its fair moment to shine. Starting out, to keep things organized, we'll look at the normal difficulty swords. As with all uniques, you can upgrade normal uniques to exceptional and exceptional to elite, with the right formulas of course, but very few in the long run really benefit from this, either due to their functionality being independent of their damage, or just because it doesn't scale as well as later weapon options. So keep that in mind before burning your runes to turn any of these into their higher stat and level requiring counterparts. The one-handed swords start off with the bare bottom of the barrel of level requirements with the level 2 unique short sword Rixit's Keen. Easily one of my favorite starter swords in the game, with decent enhanced damage, a percentage boost to attack rating, and most importantly, a lovely 25% crushing blow, available all at level 2, with absolutely no stat requirements. The only major downside is, due to being such a low level item, it's actually kind of hard to find because it falls into that weird no man's land of ultra low level uniques that often require explicitly farming for them. Next up is another one of the super low level while super useful weapons, the Blood Crescent Scimitar, with increased attack speed, okay damage for the level, open wounds, and a solid 15% resist all, not to mention some lifesteal that is only somewhat useful in normal difficulty weapons, but still not bad. Blood Crescent is another starter unique I will almost always hold on to a copy of for lower level work, and thanks to being a bit higher level than Rixit's, it becomes a bit more common to find floating around. Not really upgrade worthy, this usually does edge out a number of starter rune words early on due to its just sheer usefulness. After that, we move on to something a bit more mundane, and that is a skewer of Crintiz. I keep saying it Crinitz, but it's actually Crintiz. The saber isn't bad, but it doesn't quite live up to the strong start that the last two swords had. It's still not bad though, packing okay damage for the level, ignore target defense, some stats, and mana leech. It's a good early zeal or double swing weapon, but will usually get replaced with a solid rare or a rune word fairly early on for me. It's not bad, and it does have its niche uses for low level experiences, but it's not something I'd get too worked up over having in my arsenal or not. Continuing in the one-handers, we have Gleam Scythe, which is decent damage, though not quite as fast as some of the other options even with the increased attack speed buff. It's unfortunately a weapon I want to like because it looks like a machete ready to hack its way through Act 3, and will work just fine for that in normal, but it's also quickly outclassed by other weapons and really doesn't have even a niche use other than just being an okay damage per hit weapon. Griswold's Edge is a sword that just doesn't live up to its name for me, and that's mostly because it packs one modifier that irritates the living sin out of me on melee attacks, and that's knockback. Other than that, it's actually a fine broadsword with okay attack speed, good damage, solid attack rating boost, good fire damage for normal, and a stat boost to boot. If there was a way to strip that knockback, I would actually use this on a few early characters, but usually it just ends up in the bin for me. Next, we've got a sword that's got a mixed history, and that is Hellplague, the unique longsword. This may seem like a weird sword at first, and it kind of is, but it has really solid fire damage. It's got okay enough poison damage, dual leech, and okay just actual physical damage. It makes it a lot of fun for sword users in normal, and the plus to fire skills makes it especially fun for a Holy Fire Paladin, since it functions in the same way as Mage Fists and Leaf, providing a bonus to all fire skills, not just Sorceress ones. While it won't hold on in Nightmare for most classes, it's still a fun weapon that's often ignored. Colwyn's Point is the last normal difficulty one-hander, and it's another one with a mixed history as well, actually being sought after as an item at a few points in history. It's been somewhat relegated to the sidelines these days due to better options being available. It still packs plus skills, good attack speed and hit recovery, and okay damage. Though it's just on the edge due to the level 29 requirement, it's nowhere near as strong as it used to be, and is one of those weapons most hurt by the power creep of, well, the expansion and just time in general. For the normal two-handed swords, we see weapons that receive a bit less love because people, well, they like shields, and only the Barbarian can wield them in one hand. Starting with Shadowfang at only level 12 requirement, it's actually not a bad sword, for similar reasons that Hellplague is decent. Dual leech, good enough damage for the levels, solid elemental damage, albeit cold this time instead of fire, and even some cold resist in a vain attempt to make up for the lack of a shield. While it won't last into the mid-game, as a low-level character, it's actually good enough for getting through normal. Soulflay follows a very similar structure, albeit mostly physical damage. Again, we have dual leech, but less. This time, all resistances though, which is a little bit better than the cold resist provided by Shadowfang. There's not much that is special about the sword, but as far as low-level two-handed swords go, you can definitely do worse. Now, Knemel's Awe is an interesting little unique that most people forget about existing, but it's actually an excellent tool for chippy farming in normal, or even just equipping on a low-level paladin if your resists are fine from other sources. Mainly because this weapon may not be super fast, but it packs reasonable physical damage, okay fire damage, an attack rating boost that's pretty big for normal, and a whopping +6 to Holy Fire, which, in normal, can really ramp up your damage enough to carry you through by itself. The major drawback, though, is that it's a two-hander, and generally only useful to a paladin, with the bonuses being far less significant to any other class. Though after that, we have a sword I just don't like, and that is Black Tongue. I mean, I see the use of it, but outside of the poison resist, you can generally do better with a good 3-socket one-handed sword and a few Tal runes from the Countess. It has okay damage, it has some poison damage, and it has Prevent Monster Heal, which is a bit redundant with poison damage, but there are so many other easier to find options that I would much rather use than this. After that, we have Ripsaw, a fun weapon, albeit not much more useful than Black Tongue, packing okay damage for normal, a nice 80% chance of open wounds to deal some extra damage over time, as well as keep things from healing. It's not terrible, and it has okay speed for a two-handed sword. It just doesn't do enough special to make it really have a special place for me, that I just can't really do with some like low-level rune words that do much the same, or even better. On the tail end of the normal difficulty uniques, we have the Patriarch Greatsword, with its minimum damage being almost as high as Ripsaw's maximum damage. It does okay physical damage for late normal, even in a pinch early Nightmare, though I would want to find an upgrade fairly quickly. The Patriarch also packs some stats, damage mitigation, and a pretty good bit of extra gold for how early you can find it. The blind target functionality can also be used in a decent number of situations and strategies, but it's still not going to be like god tier or anything like that. Moving into the Nightmare difficulty swords, or more precisely, the exceptional swords, because you can find them in normal, we start on the one-handers with Bloodletter, another tiny sword that I have a lot of nostalgia for. It's not bad, and at only one level higher requirement and packing similar damage to the Patriarch, it's definitely far from bad. Combine that with increased attack speed, solid life leech, plus whirlwind and sword mastery, and you actually have a weapon that can easily carry you through Nightmare without a problem. Unfortunately, it's somewhat mediocre to upgrade due to a good chunk of its damage coming from an add damage function rather than a damage percent, but it's still good for the difficulty. While it may look less impressive on paper, Cold Steel Eye is actually a fairly solid competitor, with solid damage, attack speed, even mana leech, combined with nice modifiers like blind and slow target, all topped off with a 50% deadly strike. which makes this weapon do a lot more damage for a fast attacking character than you would think at first. It may look less impressive in the damage readout on your character screen, but what it deals out is more than enough for Nightmare because of that deadly strike chance. Moving on to Hexfire, we basically have Hellplague's big brother, plus 3 fire skills this time, and again we have the damage increase situation like Bloodletter where it's from the adds function rather than percent, but it's still not bad, especially since this has Ignore Target Defense, which can help save you on having to invest extra into Dexterity to get those hits against, well, just normal enemies at least, since Ignore Target Defense doesn't work against bosses, for example. Packing some fire resist boosts as well, it can be good for certain fights, but it's usually not the top of my list for exceptional swords, neither is it at the bottom, it's just kind of good enough. After that, we have one of the more popular magic find weapons in the game, Blade of Ali Baba. What it lacks in natural, well, usefulness in its own right, it has mediocre damage and really not ideal speed. It makes up for that with per level boost to gold and magic find, in addition to packing 2 sockets that can let you kind of modify it in pretty much any manner you want. Will it ever be best in slot for a damage dealer? God no, but it's one of the more sought after magic find items in the game thanks to, well, all these factors that we just mentioned. Thank goodness it's fairly common, so it probably won't be too expensive for you to get a hold of if you're trading for it, and it's pretty easy to find if you farm Nightmare a decent amount. Then we move on to Ginther's Rift. A great answer for early physical immunes, though it won't carry its weight too well into hell. Ginther's Rift is an auto-repairing, okay damage-dealing, fairly fast-striking source of 50 to 120 magic damage on top of its normal physical damage, of course, though it is probably more well-known for being one of the more common fashion upgrades to have an ethereal phase blade, since people used to seek out ethereal Ginther's Rifts for just that purpose. It's not even a terrible upgrade, it's just not quite on par with options of like, say, Grief. Speaking of interesting items though, Headstriker is next and is definitely one of the more fun exceptional uniques. Is it terribly fast? No, but what it does do is scale oddly well for an exceptional weapon. With a pretty good base damage, it stacks on a scaling maximum damage boost, as well as a scaling deadly strike that can, well, get over 100% easily, meaning a guaranteed double damage with each hit. The prevent monster heal thing on there is just a nice little bit of icing on the cake. Despite some mixed opinions on it, I would definitely say Headstriker fits in among the better unique swords to find while making your way through Nightmare. After that, we have a unique that I love, but is also my bane, and that is Plaguebearer, the unique rune sword that is actually a decent weapon damage-wise and packs some nice bonuses as well, such as a reasonable amount of poison damage, some poison resist, and poison nova on striking. It's not terribly slow naturally either, and the reason it's my bane is because every time rabies comes up, this sword is not far behind. It's a fun option, but not necessarily the best option for that particular build. At the tail end of the exceptional one-handers, we have the Paladin Sword, the Atlantean. Decent damage, not terribly great speed, but a Paladin can overcome that. And it's got some good stat boosts, a pretty hefty boost to attack rating. This makes the sword not bad, though moving up in the level requirement of 42 does make it compete with other, slightly more interesting options. I'd still use this if I found it usually, but again, if I had the better option, I would use the better option. Stepping into the two-handed exceptionals, we have a sword that I'll be damned if I can pronounce it right, and that is the Crotte Vomir, which every time I see it just makes me want to think crayon vomit, which, yes, I know the meaning of this French-named sword. It's not far off. That said, it's an interesting beast. Not terribly insane damage, but it packs a lot of defense and weird mods, massive attack speed boost, boosted run speed, slow target, and percent damage reduction, making it an interesting defensive choice to wield, but not necessarily the best offensive choice. Continuing the weird name trend we have, and I have to say it this way, Bings and Zwang! A two-handed cold sword, casting Frozen Orb on striking, dealing a moderately chunky amount of cold damage, and freeze target. It's not really something I use very often, it's strange for sure. It could see even use on a few builds, but if you're going two-handed swords, I can think of plenty that fill this weapon's niche a little bit better, as far as like what you can make with rune words and stuff. Next, thankfully, is something a little easier to pronounce, and that is Vile Husk, a sword I actually like sneaking on Act 5 mercenaries if I find it early, thanks to that 6% chance to cast amplified damage. It packs decent damage, scaling damage against undead on top of that, which can help you clear out some of the unleachable buggers a little quicker. The poison damage and poison resist are nice to have as well. Usually this would get quickly replaced with a Lawbringer for Decrepify, but it is still a worthy mention for a cheap early Barbarian Merc option. Cloud Crack, however, is another fall from glory weapon, basically the sword equivalent of Goldstrike Arch. It packs okay damage, some plus auras, a few offensive and defensive perks centered around lightning, but most famously it packs a chance to cast Fist of the Heavens, which used to be a lot of fun with it, but over time has just sort of fallen out of favor as the game changed and made that trigger less useful and fun to play around with. Todesfälle Flamme, or Death's Flame, is a weapon that doesn't quite live up to its namesake, kind of falling into the same category as the Bing Wang, except with fire. I want to use it because it actually looks cool, but it just doesn't carry its weight well enough to be a main. That said, you can use it as an early source of enchant for a number of characters, provided you have at least the stats to equip it, which are pretty high. At the end of the exceptionals, we have a sword I have a soft spot for that also just looks cool. It's Sword Guard. Reason for the soft spot is I actually used to use one on a super early concentration barbarian right after Lord of Destruction release, because massive shining beacon of a sword, this is very much a defensive weapon, though it does pack okay damage. It also has one of the few off-shield sources of increased block chance, and also packs resists, a per-level defense boost with exceptionally low requirements for what it is. Is it a great weapon? Not really, but I will forever keep at least one of these after I find it because, you know, memories are a thing. And finally, we move on to the elites, the things you don't have to ask, should I upgrade this? Because it's impossible, starting with the lowest level requirement elite sword, Lightsaber. Yes, that's right, it only requires level 58. Lightsaber is a good tool for dealing with physical immunes, in many cases due to packing a good mix of elemental damages and packing lightning absorb for whenever that physical immune just happens to be lightning enchanted as well. Overall though, even with ignore target defense, while this sword is fun, I generally don't find myself using it very often except in very specific scenarios where lightning will be an issue, and even then I'll often lean on different sources of dealing with that, and I will prefer different swords. Next up, we have Blood Moon, which basically reads like, we need a blood sword, make something, and they really didn't put much thought into it. It's got open wounds, life per kill, lifesteal, and enhanced damage, with a blood golem charge. This is actually one of the only weapons I can honestly say I have never bloody used. Next, though, is Jin Slayer, a weapon that I have actually used a few times. Yay for that! While comparable in damage to Blood Moon, it actually packs a fairly sizable amount of fire damage, 2 open sockets, and requires more strength than dexterity, making it a little easier to wield on characters not going for max block. After that is the first of the weird O-skill swords, Frostwind. This one is most well known for its massive boost to Arctic Blast, which due to being an O skill means it's limited to only +3 on a druid, so don't get any funny ideas. Outside of that, it's pretty much just the ice version of Jin Slayer with slightly better perks but lacking the sockets. It's fairly fast, decent cold damage, and it has a freeze target effect. Is it good for like handling some physical immunes and certain characters in a pinch? Yeah, actually with the amount of cold damage it does, though obviously a dedicated source of elemental damage will generally be better than just weapons with chunky cold or fire damage, but you use what you can get and what you need. That said, we do actually have a great physical immune killer, namely because it will just make you completely ignore like ghost physical resistance entirely. It kind of does that for all undead, by the way, and that is Alzorath, the highest level requirement unique sword in the game at level 85. It comes with plus all skills, great attack speed, decent damage for a phase blade, bonus to all attributes, and 500 to 1000 non-physical damage per hit, half cold, half magic. The main reason it's slept on is because most unique phase blades you'll find are going to be lightsabers, not this, so you have to be super lucky to get it. That said, while it's no grief, it's still a great weapon to have as an option for a number of builds, at least against normal enemies. To round out the home stretch, we have the elite two-handed sword, starting with a classic, highly sought-after weapon, Doombringer. While not as well known as Grandfather due to a few reasons, Doombringers are still fairly heavy hitters in the space with decent damage, weaken on striking, a big boost to attack rating, and life leech per hit, and a whopping 20% boost to maximum life. Before version 1.1, these were actually kind of highly sought after uniques, and one of the forgotten super expensive items of the day. Smack dab between the two legends, though, we have Flame Bellow, the Inferno cousin of Frostwind, though notably less useful unless you need some of the odd mods on it. It's a two-handed fire sword that is outclassed by your one-handed fire sword options. There's not much else to say about it besides, hey, it's got Inferno. And last, and far from least, is the ever-famous Grandfather, and frankly, it has always felt like it was half the inspiration for Breath of the Dying. With being indestructible, with big damage and attribute bonuses, and an attack rating and scaling max damage boost, it can get to quite solid amounts of damage, and it used to be highly sought after, but anymore, not so much, since it's outclassed by items that are much easier to make and find. It's still a novelty collector's item though, and actually will sometimes fetch a reasonable price, because it is still a reasonable weapon in and of itself. It's not going to be Charcy food, it's just not going to be your final setup kind of weapon usually. So what's your favorite unique sword, and what unique category should we do next? Axes, armors, pants? Oh wait, this game doesn't have pants. Either way, mention it down below, and there's a special thanks to all the channel members, patrons, and active viewers that make this content possible. In Diablo 2, there is a massive arsenal to choose from weapon-wise, but one of the most interesting but sadly underutilized is the bow, which, due to its nature as an ammo-based weapon, lends itself to some interesting design potential. While most people mistake bows as being strictly Amazon weapons, and the Amazon Uniques do contain bows themselves, the reality is the bow in Diablo 2 has a fairly long history of being the source of interesting niche and challenge build types across most of the classes, and also a really strong main choice for the Amazon, of course. Now, before we dive in, if you want to see the Amazon exclusive bows, there is a link at the end of this video for the full list of Amazon exclusive uniques. Though for now, let's dive into the truly old school weapons with the normal difficulty unique bows. Starting with Pluck Eye, we have a plucky little bow that has okay stats for its level, but doesn't do anything exceptionally amazing. The core design is a mana bow, which you'll often see as a tool for mage zons, and that will become a thing as we get further in, but due to this one's low damage, the only real benefits you're getting with this bow are the 2 mana per kill, since the enhanced damage is insignificant on a short bow, and the attack rating is quickly outclassed. That said, it could be upgraded to exceptional for a mage zon, but with insight coming to bows, it won't be worth the cost to upgrade, and you can usually find something much better. After that is Wither String, an actually worthwhile low-level bow for any character who wants to use it. While it won't see use outside of normal, mostly due to its pitiful damage, the ability to fire magic arrows is a very welcome tool early on to save money on arrows, and with the increased attack speed mod on it, and actually can fire reasonably fast compared to other bows. This isn't endgame gear, but I could use this easily into Act 3 or 4 until really feeling the need to upgrade it. Then we have Ravenclaw, something I often refer to as Kuko Jr. This bow is interesting since it's our first bow that actually has common use among non-Amazons, mostly due to the explosive arrow effect, and while it doesn't do a lot of damage normally, it pairs especially well on low-level Ranger Paladins and bow sorceresses working their way through normal and even into Nightmare. Its major drawback is that its damage falls off pretty quick, but it is still an upgrade from most of our previous bows, and at only level 15 requirement is usable pretty early. Breaking the level 20 requirement, we have Rogue's Bow, one of the better normal bows since it packs a number of nice mods, such as Deadly Strike, which helps compensate for its relatively low base damage, as well as Resist All, massive attack speed boost, and some bonus damage to undead, not to mention a small bump to attack rating. It's not great upgrade fodder, but it will easily hold you over until you're able to get the supplies for an Insight in Nightmare, or even possibly, maybe at a Stretch Harmony. Storm Strike is another interesting bow. This one is more one that I favor for early mage zons thanks to the natural piercing, which does add to your own. So while early on you won't be able to spam your freezing or exploding arrows, this bow can help you get much more out of them. That combined with the okay damage for a normal bow between physical and lightning, as well as giving you at least some of the most important normal difficulty resists, and it makes a relatively safe pick, though you will be a decent bit into normal before you can actually start using it. After that, we have Wither String's big brother, Wizendraw. Again, okay damage for normal difficulty, combined with attack rating, cold resist, and even a bit of cold resist piercing that is really uncommon at this level. And it is a sneaky way to get that function on a low-level sorceress as well, since it packs magic arrows. For anyone other than the Amazon, it makes a very nice pick up and play kind of bow. Though on the Amazon, it does give your cold arrow options early on a bit more kind of punch because of that piercing cold. I'd probably rate this one as the biggest normal difficulty sleeper weapon out of all the bows. Next we have Hellclap, a bit better minimum damage than the last couple bows, but still a fairly standard this is a fire weapon setup, with a chunk of fire damage that is decent enough for normal, okay attack speed, as well as plus to fire skills and fire resist. It's basically what you'd expect if they pretty much just copy-pasted some of the fire swords over to the bow line. The last of the normal bows is Blast Bark, which seems like it would be better than it is, but considering how late you'll start finding it in normal, it's quickly outclassed by our later options. That said, it's still not a bad bow for a low-level mage on, since it does enough damage to at least get some of the mana from the leech, albeit not enough for spamming yet, and also plus to Amazon skills and a tickle of exploding arrow on top of it. As we move into the exceptional, we start to see the more interesting design changes brought with the expansion, starting with a fairly underestimated Sky Strike, which is a good bow to find in late normal and early nightmare since it has decent mods that we like to see on bows, such as speed, okay damage, thankfully buffed by lightning, as well as attack rating and Amazon skill bumps for a little extra love. It is also our first chance to see a chance to cast bow, this time with meteors, though generally you'll only rarely see it actually hit an enemy because the meteors take so long to fall. It is fun for the fireworks. Next is Rip Hook, where we start to see the damage of the unique bows finally start to perk up a little bit in our early nightmare drops. This is a pretty underestimated bow for solo self-found runs because it has some really nice mods, with okay enhanced damage, slow target, open wounds, life leech combined with solid speed due to the base bow type and mods. It does have to compete with some pretty strong rune words, but if you're lucky enough to find this drop, you could put off farming for an insight or harmony for a bit longer. After that is Kuko Shikaku, a bow with a rather cool history in the game, at one time being part of one of the most overpowered sleeper builds in the game until the trick with it was patched out. This bow at first looks fairly basic, decent damage with extra fire on top of that, as well as points in Amazon bow skills and immolation arrow. What makes it special, and still does for rangers and bow sorceresses, is that it fires explosive arrows combined with the piercing attack. And we will see that combo be important in Crossbows too. This is because your fire damage is added to the explosion, so you can probably see why this is a common pick for Holy Fire Paladins and Enchantresses as a ranged weapon option. The Pierce makes it so that you can have even more of these explosions as well. Following that though is the comparatively disappointing Endless Hail, which is just an okay damage bow with a pinch of cold mod slapped on it. It does give you plus strafe, so it can be semi-helpful there, but it really doesn't add enough of anything to really stand out from just getting a good magic or rare bow, and usually those will give you even more bonuses. Witchwild String thankfully pulls us back into the realm of interesting bows, this one being a bow that I will sometimes even use on Act 1 rogues until I can make a Lawbringer for an Act 5 mercenary or happen to find a Reaper's Toll. This is because this bow packs a chance to cast amplified damage on striking, which really helps out a number of characters. This combined with the bow actually doing okay damage for where you'd get it, and having deadly strike percent on top of that would make it a solid choice regardless. But wait, there's more. This thing has 40% resist all, magic arrows, and another 2 sockets on top. While this bow is not best in slot, it is definitely slept on a lot whenever it shouldn't be. This is the first of the unique bows that can actually compete with some of the budget runeword bows. Going down the list, we have Windforce Light, known as Cliff Killer. This is when we see bows start to get another spike in damage, though unfortunately the other mods on this don't quite make it exceptionally great, just good enough, with its main flare being pretty much just being knockback and plus skills, which is a bit underwhelming compared to some of the earlier and far more interesting designs, so basically it's not a bad bow, it's just boring. A bow that's not nearly as boring though is Mage Wrath. Maintaining reasonable damage and attacking slightly faster, it also packs a number of interesting mods for a mage on, since it has proper mana leech unlike the previous contenders, and also has points for guided arrow and blind. And while it does lack too much beyond that, this is enough to give you one of your first unique options for a proper Ice Maiden or Fire Maiden setup, though I sadly see it getting less attention when 2.4 releases due to the other easier to get options such as Insight. The last of the exceptionals is Gold Strike Arch, another sleeper bow, oddly enough. While the first Fist of the Heavens can be kind of fun for a fireworks show, and even fun in undead areas to an extent, this bow is actually underestimated a lot. It packs reasonable damage boosts with a massive increase in attack rating and attack speed. While not super exciting, it is one of a few bows that can easily take you through the End of Hell difficulty with your boas on, and keep your attack speed churning along nicely throughout. As with other weapons, the elite options are a bit more limited here, but they're at least for the most part interesting. Well, except our first one, Eaglehorn, which is a good weapon and is basically a weird set of mods that come down to more damage, more hit chance. That said, thanks to ignore target defense, attack rating bumps, and dexterity bumps, it is a fairly reliable weapon even though it doesn't quite have the attack speed of other options. After that, we have Widowmaker, which falls into a weird space of either being adored or not even acknowledged by most players, but overall, it's actually a fairly fun build for niche builds. Well, bow for niche builds. And even non-Amazon bow variants can get a decent amount of use out of it. This is because it packs magic arrows with ignore target defense, along with classless guided arrow, meaning any character can use it. And all of that with okay damage and deadly strike. Personally, I like it a lot, even though I only very rarely have the opportunity to actually use it in a build. And here at the very end, we probably have the most popular bow in the game, sadly, Windforce. While it's not my #1 pick for a Bowzon, it is definitely up there and earns its place by punching through enemies. Even though it is fairly simple in design, with crazy high max damage for a bow, albeit underwhelming minimum damage, it packs that with okay speed for its scale, knockback, and mana leash to keep you going. While I personally prefer more speed for proc purposes, you're looking at a hard-hitting physical damage bow, this one is going to be kind of like your main go-to for that. In Diablo 2, there's a lot of unique weapons to choose from, but one of the more interesting groups for me has always been the crossbow. This is because a mix of nostalgia for whenever a few of them were considered overpowered, as well as the fact that, unlike the normal bows, they appeal to much more niche and odd builds that most people wouldn't consider playing. Though, starting out, we've got to get the basic birds out of the way, with Lead Crow, or would it be Lead Crow? Who knows, but at level 9, it can be an okay bow for a starter, thanks to that deadly strike and poison resist. But you will find that you quickly outgrow it, especially since its attack speed, like many of the normal looking crossbows, is rather abysmal. Next, we have Ichor String, packing a little bit of increased attack speed to help with that slowness we spoke of, but only a little. This is a fairly fun weapon for early mage zons thanks to the Pierce, but with lack of mana recovery, you'll find it a little underwhelming at times, or in short, other than piercing, it's not bad, it's just not better than some rares you'll find by level 18. After that, we have our first Explodey Boy, Hellcast. This is essentially the crossbow equivalent of Ravenclaw, firing exploding arrows, adding fire damage. This one even gives you a little bit of extra fire resist to boot, though unfortunately even the increased attack speed cannot make this amazing. With mediocre damage for its level, it usually flies a bit low compared to the other options as you approach your late 20s, sadly making it fit in the realm of it would be better if it required 10 levels less. The last of the normal difficulty crossbows is Doomslinger, whose base is the black sheep of the crossbow family. This is because repeating crossbows have exceptional base speed, making them more in line with normal bows, albeit using a different animation. That, however, does not help Doomslinger itself a ton since its damage is fairly low, but with plus Amazon skills, piercing attack, and an extra attack speed on top of its fast base speed, it's not as bad as it looks at first glance. It just hints at something that can be coming with the big brothers of this particular weapon. As we move into the exceptionals though, we have a weapon that I'm very nostalgic for, Lengar Bryzer, the magic fine crossbow, and funnily enough, a weapon I use both in the 1.08 version of, as well as the 1.09 version of, before sweeping changes in 1.1 kind of made it obsolete. This was because a ton of fun with multi-shot was had with this before the difficulty patches. That said, unfortunately with the current state of the game, it has really fallen off, and generally you'll only find me using it in Nightmare these days. Even though it can do mediocre in Hell, it will definitely be a lot slower than even some of the budget rune words. Next is Pus Spitter, probably the most pleasantly named item in the game, known mostly for being the Necromancer crossbow. It's an odd duck, packing +2 necro skills, a little increased attack speed, super low requirements for the damage. Even the level requirement is actually fine. It's just not best in slot for anything, and the chance to cast doesn't really work out in your favor for most builds that would consider using it. I don't hate it, it's just every time I've thought about trying to build around it, there's always been a better or more interesting option unless I wanted to just go all green or something. But in the big slot here, we actually have something that is beyond infamous, the Brisa do Cannon. I'm actually not sure how to pronounce that, but it used to be quite accurately labeled the Noob Cannon, so Cannon seems appropriate. Since during its early days, Guided Arrow could pierce, and due to this weapon's massive damage, stacked with that, and its auto-piercing, it was able to decimate both players and bosses. Though with patches, that auto-piercing was removed from Guided Arrow, just leaving us with a much less noob-friendly still cannon. That said, it's still solid, with good damage, good attack speed for a normal crossbow at least, and of course it still has piercing for the other arrow shots, as well as like freezing target, cold damage, dexterity, etc. It's still good, it's just not good enough to compete with things like Windforce anymore. The last of the exceptionals is probably my favorite crossbow, though that's because I'm really biased towards it, and that's the Demon Machine. Not to be confused with Demon Crossbow, which is a base. This bow does pack some nice mods, most notably pairing Exploding Arrow with Piercing Attack, letting you chew through enemies with it on a few builds due to the mechanics of how well Exploding Arrow works. This combined with actually okay damage, attack rating, and attack speed makes it a fairly solid option for players seeking a crossbow to use, especially for non-Amazons. As we move into the elites, we've got the Hell Rack, a bow that I want to like, with a good deal of elemental and physical damage, and 2 open sockets. The big drawback is that it's just a bit slow, and it lacks the pierce that makes Bariza interesting, while being very similar in physical damage at higher levels. While I wouldn't say no to using it, by the time you get to 76, you'll likely have at least one of the more budget bows that are competitive with this, if not better, both in damage and speed. So it sits collecting dust, as I hope one day to find a reliable use for this where I won't just be saying, but Bariza's better. And lastly, something I've weirdly used in solo self-found more than once is Gut Siphon. It's actually a super rare elite crossbow that I stumble upon more than I would necessarily want. It's okay, it's got decent base attack speed, mediocre damage, a lot of life leech though, with open wound and slow target and piercing attack as icing on the cake. I generally won't use it in final builds, but I do have some fond memories of using this bow while waiting for upgrades. It's just, again, not best in slot compared to a lot of other options. Overall, the crossbows could use some work. Some skill nerfs really broke the functionality of several of the key crossbows, and is one of the reasons I would love to see Guided Pierce return against monsters, but not against players, because that was absolutely fucking broken. Among other tweaks, of course. That said, do you have a favorite crossbow or a fond memory from your early days of playing with them? Mention it down below. In Diablo 2, there's a lot of uniques, some super popular, but some painfully overlooked. Today we're going to look at the latter, the unique clubs, not to be confused with hammers and maces. The big advantages of clubs are their relatively low requirements compared to other mace class weapons, as well as their more utility-driven stats. We see this from the very start with the unique club itself, Fell Oak. While not insanely high damage and even a bit of knockback making it mediocre for proper melee, it stacks on exceptionally high resist for its level with 60% lightning and 20% fire resist, making it a fairly reasonable low-level defensive weapon, and with 0 requirements outside of levels, it's especially nice for early casters until they can get to the upgrades you start to get in the late teens. The next club is a little less impressive, and that's Stout Nail, but this one is a little better as a low-level weapon since it does okay in damage for level 5 and has some minor nice perks. But generally speaking, this is an item you'll only use if you find it on a solo self-found run, and you'll very quickly outclass it as you get access to rune words like Malice and Steel in other weapons. As we move into the exceptional clubs, we get to the Druid-themed weapons, starting with Dark Clan Crusher, which is just an okay, low-requirement weapon with plus Druid skills, solid enhanced damage, even if the base damage is relatively low, as well as bumps to attack rating and even some demon-slaying-themed boosts to damage, attack rating, and life per demon kill. Is it going to be the best in slot weapon? No, but you'll be hard-pressed to find something this powerful in late normal, early nightmare, while still keeping a low 25 strength requirement. Though at just 5 strength more, you have a weapon that is fairly good for being an interim weapon for Smiters and Blade Fury Assassins, but can also be a solid placeholder weapon for most melee builds, and that is Flesh Render, packing a similar plus skills and enhanced damage to Dark Clan Crusher, but better base damage as well as a plus min-max damage on top of it. What it makes it really nice is the inclusion of Crushing Blow, Deadly Strike, and Open Wounds that can be exceptionally useful to a few builds. Though as usual, there are higher requirement weapons that are better for individual jobs. This is just a solid pickup that is relatively easy to use. As we move into the elite clubs, we do unfortunately lose out on some of the low requirement advantages, since the stat requirements do spike up for these bases. That said, Nord's Tenderizer is still pretty good for the requirements, with solid damage and speed, as well as great bonus to attack rating, solid cold damage, freeze target, and cold absorb. I have used these a few times on solo self-found runs to finish all of Hell difficulty, so it's not a bad weapon for the job as long as you use it properly. And lastly, we have the one club that people generally will recognize, and that is Demon Limb, most known for its level 23 enchant charges for pre-buffing, but as a weapon, it's not terrible, though at the strength requirement for it, you'll generally be better off picking up a bigger weapon for primary use, since it is essentially just the fire equivalent of Nord's Tenderizer, but with a bit slower speed. And before it's said, if you're looking for videos on the maces, hammers, scepters, and other blunt weapons, stay tuned because those are coming soon. To continue our journey into the uniques of Diablo 2, let's continue our way into something you just can't touch, the unique hammers. These are generally high strength, high power, and low speed weapons, but with the right ones you can pull off some fairly nasty builds, and there's a reason they're considered some of the strongest sleepers of the Uniques. In the normal hammers, we'll start with Ironstone, a fairly solid damage one-handed weapon, albeit with, well, abysmal speed. Ironstone is literally what this weapon set is designed for, a heavy-hitting hammer that takes a little while to swing. It packs some strength and attack rating, but beyond that it's not terribly special outside of, well, hitting fairly hard, and actually being an okay early vengeance weapon for bosses, though usually you'll want something faster to overcome missed attacks. Next up, we have Bone Snap, which is a fairly solid mid-tier hammer, often treated as the precursor to weapons like Ribcracker for a number of builds, and is also a fairly solid upgrade to Exceptional Candidate. This is because it has okay speed for a hammer, really solid enhanced damage, cold and fire resist to make up for the loss of a shield, and a really nice 40% crushing blow. And with how common it is, you can usually find a ton of these even in free stuff games. The last normal difficulty hammer is Steel Driver. While it lacks the crushing blow of Bone Snap, it makes up for it by packing in increased attack speed, solid damage, and relatively low requirements for a weapon in its damage range. While it doesn't do anything terribly special, it really is a good two-hander in normal difficulty, though for boss killing I usually prefer Bone Snap, this is because crushing blow, but this can still be a solid item for progression through the meat of the game. Starting out in the exceptionals, we have the first of the elemental druid hammers with Earthshaker. Definitely one of the weirder weapons in the game that may become more useful in 2.4, it packs plus elemental skills for the druid as well as a reasonable enhanced damage, increased attack speed, and target blinding. The main thing that keeps it from being more interesting to me is that it has the unfortunate knockback effect, which holds it back from being used on a shape-shifting fire druid using Armageddon and Fireclaw, since this will continue to reposition the enemy on hitting, which can be really frustrating for Fireclaw or any melee druid. After that, we have Blood Tree Stump, which is a fairly nice one for barbarians with plus to all masteries and even more plus skills specifically for mace mastery. It packs 50% crushing blow, a solid strength bump, and 20% resist all to make up for the loss of a shield. But with lower enhanced damage potential than Bone Snap, for non-barbarians, I'll often prefer an upgraded Snap over this just for that ire-based damage. Closing out the exceptionals, we have one of the more badass sounding uniques, the Gavel of Pain, though it unfortunately does not do much to live up to the name. With relatively mediocre enhanced damage percent and just an okay boost to min-max damage, its raw damage will lag a bit behind an upgraded Steel Driver. That said, it does come with some interesting perks, namely Amplify Damage charges, as well as a chance to cast Amplify Damage on striking and a chance to cast Iron Maiden when struck. Personally, I've always found it interesting, but I've almost always found things I would rather use in its slot, especially with Decrepify available relatively easily on a couple of other weapons. As we move to elites, you'll notice we have a lot more items in this column. That's because Hammer's got a good number of double elites. Starting with the legendary mallets, we have the more common Stone Crusher, which is one of the rare sources of the damage plus modifier, albeit one of the weaker ones. It also packs a reasonable amount of base damage combined with crushing blow and reduced enemy defense, not to mention added strength, though considering the base strength required for this, you usually won't need that at this point. It's an okay one-handed hammer, but only brings a bit to the table to compensate for its slower speed. The other legendary mallet, which is only 1 in 5 of the mallets dropped, is Schaefer's Hammer, a much more interesting weapon than its cousin, with increased attack speed to help with a bit of the abysmal hammer speed, a pinch of enhanced damage, lightning resist, and even life. It is mostly used for its last 2 traits though, the 20% chance to cast Static Field, and its built-in Fool's mod that gives you plus maximum damage and attack rating based on level, making it get more and more dangerous with each level you get. This can be a fairly fun vengeance weapon or just a fun hammer to wield on a number of builds, but it usually won't fall in as best in slot, especially since it falls into the same issue as other indestructible weapons in that it can never spawn ethereal. After that, we move on to the Ogre Maul Windhammer, a weapon that a lot of veteran players know by heart. This is an exceptionally nice hammer with a massive attack speed boost, 50% crushing blow, solid enhanced damage for its other stats, and a 1 in 3 chance of casting a decent level Twister on striking. This can be a fun druid weapon for smacking stuff around in either were form, bear or wolf, and the Twister Stun can be super useful. It does not quite beat out other certain bigger and nastier weapons, but it is still entirely competitive and can be used to pretty much get anywhere in hell just fine. In the Thunder Mauls, we again have another druid-oriented weapon, but this time one used for a very niche build, and that is Earth Shifter, a weapon that still fits in that "this is weird" space for me, but is useful for fire elemental shapeshifters, but this time with a lot more useful mods than Earthshaker. This packs a whopping +7 to elemental skills, a bit of increased attack speed and cast rate, as well as a great bit of enhanced damage and a solid amount of crushing blow. This combined with casting Fissure on striking can be used to turn a normally all physical druid build into a fire-wielding powerhouse. I'm looking forward to where it goes in 2.4. It is worth noting it does not come with that socket in it. I put it there since I use this one, though I did clear out the rune so the stats were more clear. And last but not least is the Cranium Basher, which takes the other approach to dealing with physical immunes, and that is by casting amplified damage on striking. This throws on some attack speed, boosted damage, and strength, but more importantly has a whopping 75% crushing blow and an okay 25% boost to resist. Being indestructible again works against this weapon unfortunately, since you'll never find it ethereal, but it can be a fun weapon for punching through immunes for a Maul user. Though generally I would prefer Windhammer and an Earth Shifter over this weapon most days, at least as far as the Uniques go. Anywho, that's the hammers. Next up we have the maces, which also pack a few very interesting pockets of power. Among the most popular uniques in Diablo 2, we have maces, the most balanced of the basic blunt weapons. They're all one-handed with a solid mix of speed, requirements, and power that hit the sweet spots between the heavy-hitting hammers and the faster, low-requirement clubs we've covered before. So this is where you probably want to look if you're just needing something reliable for your melee characters that want to use blunt weapons. As usual, starting out in normal items, we start with the low requirement unique mace called Crush Flange, and while it packs the knockback attribute that I hate in melee weapons, it is a great source of crushing blow for early boss killing, and even one of my ideal weapons for early leveling on a kickstand, since it has okay speed, plus a good chunk of strength, and a massive amount of fire resist. It is very handy for a lot of early builds, and I almost always keep one in spite of my aversion for that knockback stat. Next, we have Blood Rise, the Morning Star, a generally all-around decent weapon to find early on and can even be used in a pinch in Nightmare if you upgrade it to Exceptional. This is because it packs itself with just decent stats. A bit of increased attack speed, a solid amount of enhanced damage by %, that's important, and a great bump to attack rating, not to mention some gravy in the form of Life Leech and Open Wounds. It's not going to be best in slot, but it is a competent item and will be competent in slot. The last of the normal maces is the General's Tando Liga, which personally I sadly find less useful than the previous two maces, despite it having a faster attack speed, so you'll only see it come out on top for me if I'm playing in early Oradin for that extra speed of striking. It's not even that it has bad stats for a normal weapon, it does have a great speed, mana leech, and even slow target, which is extra handy while using Zeal to keep a crowd in control, but it doesn't scale as nice as the other two since it only has a small enhanced damage % boost and relies on a plus-min max to make up the gap, meaning it does not upgrade well like I said, so unlike the crushing blow on Crush Flange and the triple-digit enhanced damage on Blood Rise, making this a knout will just feel mediocre, so it keeps this relegated to normal difficulty mostly. As we move into the exceptionals, we see an elemental shift in the maces, not unlike a lot of other weapon types. This doesn't come at nearly the same cost to damage boost though. For example, with Sure Frost, we still get a fairly reasonable enhanced damage boost on top of packing in okay cold damage. Freeze target, cannot be frozen, the works. And even though it will never be your best in slot endgame weapon, it's still quite good for Nightmare difficulty since it does okay damage, and that cannot be frozen can save your butt a lot if you do not have a Raven Frost. Next up is a guilty pleasure of mine, and that is Moonfall, probably the weakest of the three exceptionals. It's basically the fire cousin of Shrill with similar damage, albeit a slightly slower swing. Since it packs such similar damage, even down to the amount of elemental damage it does, the main things that set this weapon apart are the magic damage reduction and the chance to cast Meteor, which can make it an interesting Enchantress weapon as you're progressing through Nightmare, since these boosts do get a fairly significant benefit from your Fire Mastery skill on top of the double dipping on Enchantress enchant itself. Last, and far from least of the exceptionals, is Basil's Vortex. As with most flail bases, it's speedy, and unlike the Tandalaga, it packs a reasonable amount of enhanced damage by percent. On top of that though, it also has a very nice lightning theme with the same amount of average elemental damage as Churchill and Moonfall, though higher max, albeit in the usual highly variable format lightning is known for. Look at that minimum damage, it's tiny. This combined with chance to cast Nova and a solid bit of lightning resist, and it rounds out the 3 major elements for the group of weapons. One oddity that is helpful but a little odd on this weapon though is that it also packs a good chunk of extra mana, which while unnecessary is still very nice for keeping you topped off because maximum mana determines your mana regeneration. As we hit the elites, we run into some of the more infamous weapons in the game, starting with Baranar's Star, which before the days of runewords like Passion and Grief was one of the mainstays of a number of characters from some Zealot builds all the way to the melee sorceresses, mostly thanks to packing a triple threat of each element's damage, a great increased attack speed boost, a chunky increase to attack rating, as well as boosts to strength and dexterity, all stacked with a solid enhanced damage percent. While it's nowhere near as high as it used to be on the weapon totem, it's still a very solid weapon that can give you a good chance all the way through the end of hell. After that, we have the double Scourges, starting with Horizon's Tornado, the less impressive of the two, but still fun weapon. It packs really good increased attack speed on top of an already fast base, good enhanced damage, and even a couple of fun perks in the form of Slow Target, and a 1 in 5 chance of casting a reasonable level Tornado on striking. And with its lowered requirements, it's not even that difficult for characters to equip. While outside of a couple of builds, it would be 3rd place in the elites for me, it's still a more than competent weapon. And lastly, we have a weapon that lands as best in slot for a few builds, and that's Stormlash, which is basically a grown-up version of Horizon's with a bit less enhanced damage and attack speed. The reason for this, though, is so sought after at least, is usually the fact that it's in a special zone of having really good attack speed on top of both Crushing Blow and a chance to cast Static Field to quickly zip the life of larger bosses down. It does this with some other nice traits though, like extra lightning damage, damage absorb, and retaliation, all of the lightning variety, as well as casting a slightly better tornado than Horizon's. It's just a really solid weapon that does a lot of things very well. Overall, I enjoy the unique maces, and they're definitely worth consideration, though if you're looking for other weapons, we've got a fairly solid library of the other unique weapons and armors in this game manual playlist, with groups like Scepters, Staves, Axes, and Wands coming very soon. One of the upcoming changes in 2.4 is the change of Sword Mastery to Blade Mastery, basically extending it to include daggers. So today we're going to look at the unique options in the dagger space, since these, as well as the runewords we've covered previously, provide some interesting tools for a number of builds. Starting out in normal, we interestingly have one of the most popular and infamous daggers, Gull Dagger. The things a lot of people basically rush to gamble for early on. And if you have good luck, you might just be able to gamble it with a level 11 character and get you a really solid early magic find tool that actually is also an okay weapon early on as well, though it is pretty much just restricted to casters by late normal because, well, it's low damage. After that is a dagger most people have forgotten about, but was laughed about a lot back in the day, and that is the Diggler Dirk, which is a reference that has been sadly forgotten over the years, or maybe that's for the better, but just be sure to turn down the bass before you listen to this weapon sing. As far as the stats, it's actually a fairly decent weapon early on, and about the same as Gull Dagger for how long that lasts, though with Ignore Target Defense and Resist, it can be stretched a little bit further for some builds, but you usually will want to upgrade eventually. Next, we have the Jade Tan Doe, a poisonous crisp blade. Overall, a weapon that unfortunately falls into a weird space due to its level requirement. While not terrible, with okay poison damage, massive poison resists, and cannot be frozen, it does have utility. It just comes at a level where generally it's competing with the likes of Malice and often even higher things. That said, the poison is good for stopping enemy healing, it's just you won't be doing amazing physical damage or anything like that super quickly. Though nowhere near as mediocre is Spectral Shard, a weapon that used to be fairly popular even in its weaker original form, but that became a really strong budget option for spam casters across the board due to its exceptionally early access to a whopping 50% faster cast, basically doing for casting speed what Gull Dagger does for magic find. On top of that, it actually packs some nice resistant mana and a bit superfluous addition of attack rating, but other than that it's fairly solid, albeit generic, and it's used as a caster weapon early on a lot of times. Moving into exceptionals, we become a bit less caster-oriented with the Spine Ripper, the first truly reasonable melee-capable dagger. It packs a weird mix of mods that seem like they made a decent combat dagger with enhanced damage, attack speed, ignore target defense, life leech, and even prevent monster heal, and then threw the plus necro skills on there as a distraction to make people think it's a poison dagger weapon. And while it can be used for that, it's actually much better as a warrior princess weapon on the Amazon, or as a reasonable albeit short-range stopgap through Nightmare for more normal melee builds. Next is Heart Carver, a weapon that might see more use, especially if upgraded in 2.4, depending on just how Grim Ward and Blade Mastery end up feeling in the end. This is because it packs decent enhanced damage, ignore target defense, and Deadly Strike for doubling that damage. It's kind of a good combo. It's just not going to beat out Grief, but it is poised to become a very solid weapon due to the interesting mix of skills and power it has kicking around on it. Though, back on the Poison Necro, we have Black Bog's Sharp, the actual poison dagger. Obviously packing a lot less physical damage, but loading up on poison damage of its own, not to mention increased attack speed and target slowing to get those swings in while shutting down the enemy's speed themselves. What's really nice about it is that it packs plus to all the Necro poison skills. The only drawback of this monstrosity of a dagger is that, well, as it stands, Poison Dagger still royally sucks, since its damage per second is atrociously low, meaning you're usually just better off casting Poison Nova unless you really double down and understand how poison works and can kind of exploit it to a bit, and even then it's just for a painfully niche build that doesn't have much reward over the standard Poison Necro. Equally disappointing, at least to an extent, is Storm Spike, the Lightning Dagger, that despite its completely unique sprite, not even sharing it with other daggers, it just has middling damage, both physical and lightning. It casts low-level Charge Bolt, yay, and retaliates with a pitiful amount of lightning damage. Its only real redeeming quality is the scaling lightning resist bump of 1% per level. I've yet to find a build I really want to use this on, and believe it or not, I really wish that wasn't the case. As we move into the elites though, things do look up a little bit, with one of the more popular faster cast weapons in the game, Wizard Spike, which basically takes Spectral Shard and turns it up to 11, with the same 50% faster cast, but massive mana perks and a whopping 75% resist all. Not to mention indestructible to boot, though I doubt you'd ever bother stabbing with it, because, well, it has terrible damage. But you'll find this often sitting on a number of characters where casting more, faster, is their one and only true goal, and they want the resist for survivability. It's also really popular in hardcore. The other indestructible elite dagger is less popular in hardcore, and that's Ghost Flame. A decent enough weapon, though definitely not worth its rarity. It always spawns ethereal, it packs some okay mods like ignore target defense, flat magic damage, and mana leech. The catch is, it doesn't really bring much to the table other than something to deal with physical immunes, though. So I guess with its indestructibility, it could work for some faster striking builds, since daggers do run down fairly fast, but the reality is, outside of the Warrior Princess Amazon, a Grief Phase Blade is going to do a bit more work without the drawbacks, and even on the Warrior Princess Amazon, the Grief is probably going to be the better choice. Finally, we have a weapon I'm looking forward to in the updated 2.4 patch, and that's Flesh Ripper, the unique fanged knife. This weapon may just have okay damage, but it makes up for it with a nice mix of abilities, namely Crushing Blow, Deadly Strike, Open Wounds, and Slow Target. While it's rarely best in slot, it is frequently used as a more reasonable budget item for a number of Uber and Boss Hunter builds, and should end up making for the fun dual wield for a Frenzy Barb when Blade Mastery becomes a reality. Mainly because, see how exceptionally stabby it makes him look? Anyway, as always, a special thanks to the channel patrons and members for making this content possible, as well as the regular viewers and commenters who help bring interesting ideas to life. Polearms are in an interesting space for uniques, since with the prevalence of rune words, it's fairly rare a unique item can compete with the top slots, but polearms fly in the face of that, with several of them being competitive with rune words, and a few even being best in slot for several builds. So today, let's take a look at that. As usual, we should probably start with the normal uniques and move our way up to show the progression. The most basic one being Dim Oak's Hue. A fairly solid polearm for level 8 despite its low damage, it packs a bit of increased attack speed, a fairly large chunk of dexterity for the level, and a solid amount of enhanced damage. While it's not going to be a great weapon in Nightmare, in terms of punching your way through normal with a polearm, it can be a solid option. Next is a polearm that is pretty much the opposite for me, and that is Steel Goad, because it's a melee weapon that has monster flee on it, which I find annoying as hell. But it does have a good chunk of deadly strike and a little bit of resist to help out. I just don't find it redeeming enough, especially since Dim Oak's average damage is only a little lower than this weapon's maximum. After that, we have a much more reasonable polearm for use, and that is Soul Harvest, which is basically just a somewhat better Malice for more relaxed play. With decent reliable damage, mana leech, open wounds, and a fairly large boost to all resist, has the defensive perks to make up for losing a shield early while still doing okay with the rest of its functionality. Malice will be a little better for speed, but this definitely sits strong where it's at in normal. Next is Battle Branch, a polearm that pretty much guarantees my use of an Act 2 Mercenary in normal if I find it, and that's because it's when you first start seeing polearm damage really go up. But on top of that, it packs solid increased attack speed and life leech, which are awesome on a mercenary, and the little bit of dexterity can be nice as well if you're using this on a druid build instead. Another interesting normal polearm is Woe Stave, the unique halberd. Packing similar damage to Battle Branch, it may lack increased attack speed, but it packs in a lot of mods that really mess with the enemy, with 50% open wounds, blind target, freeze target, and slow target. It can really make enemies much easier to deal with than otherwise would be. And like Battle Branch, this can be semi-useful even into early Nightmare and is a candidate for possible exceptional upgrade if you don't find better, since it's relatively cheap, though I wouldn't take either to Elite. Last up in normal is the Grim Reaper, which sounds scarier than it is. Unlike the previous two, this is only a mediocre upgrade candidate compared to them because it relies on a smaller percent boost, but it does have nice enough mods to carry you into Nightmare at least, despite being listed with less raw damage, and that's because of the 100% deadly strike, effectively doubling the damage output with this weapon. And the little bit of mana leech to keep you swinging is pretty nice too. In the exceptionals, we have a little bit of an odd fascination with plus skills on polearms, starting with the aptly named Meat Scraper, which packs itself with a life leech and open wounds as the name suggests, but also decent damage, increased attack speed, and plus to Barbarian Masteries. Combined with a pinch of Magic Find, I've used it a few times in Nightmare for solo self-found runs, and it works out just fine for that purpose. Another somewhat fun good in Nightmare polearm is the Black Leech Blade, which brings a few interesting tidbits to the table. With reasonable damage and a bit lower requirement, but still comes with enough life leech to matter, and also packs on a scaling maximum damage per level, and even throws in a chance to cast Weaken on Striking, which can be pretty useful for reducing the potency of enemies, or even helping counteract some of the boosts they can get from boss mob auras, or even just weakening them in general. Though, as of recording this, they have not stated specifically how they're going to modify Weaken in 2.4, so we'll see how that pans out in the future. It could be better, it could be worse. Back on the plus skills trend I mentioned, we have Athena's Wrath, with plus to druid skills, increased attack speed, and a double dip of damage boost with both the normal percent boost as well as plus maximum damage per level effect. It also stacks in a boost to dexterity and a scaling boost to life as well. Though with how mechanics work, that would be scaled better with just flat plus life, but it's still not bad, and it is a good Fury Druid weapon in Nightmare. After that, we have the Barbarian version with Pierre Tombale Couant, which I will never be able to pronounce properly, and that was probably a complete butchering, and I apologize. But it does come with 3 Barbarian skill levels, a chunky amount of damage, as well as mana leech, faster hit recovery, and attack rating, but more importantly than any of that, a 55% chance of deadly strike, which can help double the damage you do with this already reasonably high damage polearm. Only real drawback is its speed, or lack thereof, but not all skills necessarily need to aim for that. Getting off of skills for a second again, we have another polearm I will mispronounce, and that is the Husoldal Evo. With a bit more variable damage than our last entry, this one does come with increased attack speed and slips in replenished life, though it loses out on a lot of nice perks that came with it as well, so while this is a big stick that will hit hard, it's usually not among my top picks for the exceptional polearms, especially with its comparatively high stat requirements. The last of the exceptionals goes back to plus skills, and is actually a weapon I've made builds around from time to time just for fun, and that is Grimm's Burning Dead. It's basically the Necromancer Scythe, and yes, I have an upgraded one as well, just for that use. But basically it packs plus Necro skills to fit the theme, but also packs in some traits that really do make it a bit more viable for Necromancers, such as minus requirements, minus enemy defense, plus attack rating, and even a bit of off-weapon boosted defense. All of this with a reasonable bump to damage, as well as extra raw fire damage and fire resist. It's not the be-all, end-all of polearms, but I do appreciate what they were going for with the Grim Reaper Necromancer vibe, though I would have swapped the base for this and Athena's personally for a more authentic look. Then finally, we get into the elites, with each of these having actually had at least a bit of time in the limelight at one point or another. 2 of them are still highly sought after, with the other 2 being more just fun diversions anymore. One of those diversions is Bone Hew, which some people will hate me calling it a diversion, but it's casting Bone Spear on striking. It's not always ethereal, but I figured I'd show this one off since people act weird when I mention having used one late game on a solo self-found run, since I actually slapped 2 Am runes into this natural 2 sockets previously, and it worked out exceptionally well on my mercenary. After that, we have one of the more sought-after polearms, which is often considered one of the best in-slot options for Act 2 mercenaries, and that is Reaper's Toll. Usually preferably ethereal, but non-ethereal is plenty strong, packing reasonable enhanced damage, ignore target defense, life leech cold damage, and deadly strike. Even with its base functions, it would be strong. But what makes it so desirable is actually a 33% chance of casting Decrepify, which is pretty much a guaranteed piercing of physical immunity when triggered, and works exceptionally well for a lot of builds in the game. So while you may hear about Insight and Infinity more because of how many people just favor casters, this is the polearm you want for any physical damage builds. Next is a polearm that is used in a lot of things, but probably the most popular is on druids, though Act 2 mercenaries can use it as well, and that is Tomb Reaver. With massive natural attack speed, great damage, resist all, life per kill, mana find, etc. It is just a great polearm to begin with and would be good even without sockets, but the fact that it can spawn with anywhere from 1 to 3 sockets can make it quite powerful, with one of the most sought after versions being a high roll with 3 sockets and ethereal, since it is easily one of, if not the best weapon for Fury Druids in the game for just raw damage, even if you have to burn a Zod on it, though even non-ethereal is still a great weapon. Last up is Stormspire, which did have a super brief time in the limelight, but is pretty much forgotten about nowadays. It just doesn't stack up to the other big polearms, though it does stick with its lightning theme quite well, with Chain Lightning and Charge Bolt when struck, Lightning Retaliation, Lightning Resists, and Lightning Damage stacked on top of moderate damage for an elite and increased attack speed. It's cool, it's rare, but it's not really important to any major builds. Having one of the longest ranges of a melee weapon in Diablo 2, spears have a rather interesting history in the game, at one point being the go-to weapon for barbarians, at other times being considered mostly worthless. In the modern Diablo 2 Resurrected, they actually do have a place, both on players and mercenaries, so today we're going to take a look at the unique spears of Diablo 2, the good, the bad, and just the plain weird. Before we jump in, if you are looking for the Amazon exclusive spears, they are part of the Amazon Uniques video you can find linked in both the card up top as well as in the description down below, with the points of mainly keeping them separate since only a single class can use them, and if you're looking for all the other uniques, stay tuned to the channel because we will be hitting them as well, if we haven't already gotten to the one you want to see when you stumble across this. Anyways, starting out at the bottom, we have Dragon Chang, a weapon most people never really see or use because it falls into the weird category a lot of low-level uniques do, where they require farming oddly low-level areas to increase their drop rate. As far as stats go, it's really not impressive enough to justify doing that, just in the first place. With okay damage for level 8, but that quickly gets outclassed as soon as you get to Act 2 and normal by magic and rare items that can provide way similar buffs and a lot more damage. Next we have Razortine, a fairly well-recognized spear for equipping on low-level mercenaries. Razortine has reasonably decent mods with increased attack speed and plus stats, not to mention reduced enemy defense, helping your mercenary hit more often. The thing Razortine is most well known for though is one of the early introductions to the slow target effect, which does just what it says. It slows enemies struck by the weapon. The only major drawback of this weapon is its damage output, which, like the Dragon Chang, is good for its level requirement, but is quickly outclassed by bigger weapons, though this at least has other mods that can keep its worth up a little bit. Next we have Blood Thief, a reasonable mercenary weapon for early on that can be okay if you're playing a spear build yourself, packing open wounds and strength. It has okay uses. It even packs a bit of life leech and a bit more damage boost than lower spears. Only downside is that life leech at this low level, while useful, won't do much more than a few points here or there due to the low damage you'll be doing with weapons of this tier. I like it for early mercenary weapons, but beyond that, it usually just sits collecting dust in favor of bigger spears or polearms. Lance of Yagai, though, is an interesting spear for me, and yes, I do have to say it that way. At first glance, it may seem mundane, but early on, it actually brings a lot to the table for a level 22 requirement weapon. It's got about as much damage as other spears in the raw physical damage sense, without any plus damage modifiers, but it also packs a 40% increased attack speed and a decent punch of lightning damage to help it actually reach reasonable average damage output for how early you'd get it. All of this with a bonus perk of Resist All to make up for the lack of a shield makes it a pretty sweet deal for normal, though unfortunately it also means it does not upgrade well. The last normal difficulty spear is one that you can actually use in Nightmare difficulty due to its raw damage, and that is the Tanner Gorrod, with reasonable enhanced damage percent on top of a solid base damage, along with packing on fairly decent fire damage on top of that. Mercenaries in particular, or even jab-based Amazons, can get some reasonable damage out of this. Yes, it's slower than the other spears, but it's got a good deal of punch to back it up, and a Shell Rune can help that out a lot for a cheap bump up. Tanner Gorrod can also help your mercenary's survival against Diablo, Mega Demons, and the Council, thanks to its fire resist bump. Is it going to last you all the way through hell? No, but it can work through most of Nightmare. Into the exceptional list, we start with the Impaler, a spear very much intended to be used with, well, impale, packing reasonable damage for its speed, some useful hit chance buffs, a chance of open wounds, along with +2 impale and power strike for an Amazon. This can actually tide the spear Amazon over through Nightmare if you don't find something more utilitarian. And with the changes coming in 2.4, this item's usefulness may actually increase for the players making their way through the game with this easier to find gear. Next, we have Razortine's big brother, the Kelpie Snare, a fairly decent mercenary weapon thanks to the massive slow target effect on it, basically turning your mercenary into a tool for locking down various bosses and such, basically by slowing them down to a literal crawl. On top of that, it does okay damage for the level, gives some plus stats in life, as well as packing in a pretty large fire resist buff should your mercenary need it. It definitely falls in on my underappreciated uniques list, even though it's not really ever best in slot. It doesn't hurt that it looks kind of cool in Diablo 2 Resurrected, and that it is actually somewhat functional for a number of builds. The next one, however, Sulfie's Tine, has always felt a bit underwhelming to me, mainly because it falls into a similar category as Blood Thief. It's an okay damage weapon with Leech. That said, Sulfie's Tine does the job a bit better, thanks to actually having reasonable damage, and the fact that it's dual Leech rather than just Life Leech, meaning it can be used in conjunction with various skills effectively, like Fend or Jab, while still keeping your mana topped off. The weapon overall, though, just kind of feels mediocre to use. A not-so-mediocre weapon is one that actually is one of the best mercenary weapons in the game, and that is the Hone Sudan Yari. This weapon falls into the category of socket uniques that I absolutely love, but they very rarely get good treatment. But it does it in an exceptional way. With solid damage, 45% crushing blow, and auto repair, even in the non-ethereal version it's a solid weapon for both player and mercenary, but if you find a high percent ethereal one, it can be upgraded and turned into an exceptionally powerful standalone weapon for any spear wielder, thanks to its high base damage potential and 3 sockets that allow you to shape the weapon into whatever you want. Do you need speed? You get Shales. Do you need Leech? You get an Am. There's even people with resources to burn that have put Bear Runes in it, though I'd personally avoid that. There's better uses for Bear Runes. And with that auto repair, the ethereal ones are not mercenary exclusives or Zod fodder, so you can use them to make some seriously fun builds. The last of the exceptionals is Spire of Honor, a spear that has always felt weird to me with its boost to combat skills for Paladin. It's almost like they wanted to make spear zealots or spear chargers a thing and forgot about it. This weapon does lean into that second concept a bit since it packs attack rating bonuses and damage bonuses to demons, as well as some defensive perks to try and wean you off the shield of a Paladin that the Paladin always uses, with off-armor enhanced defense and faster hit recovery being quite useful. I think this would be seen more of use if it had resist, but it's still not a bad spear, it just doesn't quite compete with the flexibility of things like Hone Sudan. And finally we move into the elite spears, starting with Ariok's Needle, which, no, is not always ethereal. This is just the first one I grabbed for my Go Mule, but it is the one I kept with a purpose, since this spear is another quite good mercenary weapon. Not only does it have increased attack speed, decent damage, ignore target defense, a trickle of poison damage, and deadly strike to pump up your damage per second, it also has variable plus to all skills. And the all skills part is important, since yes, that plus skill also applies to your mercenary's aura and jab skill, giving them a little extra utility if what you need from them is for that specific aura to be reasonably stronger. On a low roll, this isn't very noticeable, but for all skills to a might aura is an extra 40% enhanced damage, which if you don't have a much more expensive pride to take its place, is not half bad. Next is Viper Fork, a spear I keep wanting to use but never really seem to get around to. For the most part, it's not that special, with really good increased attack speed and decent enough enhanced damage, and some poison related perks. Part of me wants to see if I can get that level 9 poison explosion on striking to do something useful. While I know it never will, I'm always intrigued by corpse utility setups. Whether it's returning from killing or rest in peace effects, this weapon is just an example of an extremely unique weapon effect that has always kind of sat in the background forgotten. And last up is a weapon that has kind of suffered from its own stats, Steel Pillar, which unfortunately is indestructible, which means it will never spawn ethereal and be a dangerous elite weapon. That said, it does have decent stats, with reasonable damage, a bit of increased attack speed, crushing blow. It can do okay damage, though I'd usually favor a Hone Sudan or Obedience over this due to much greater flexibility. But it is also worth noting, if you're aiming for defense tanking, this can actually be a fun weapon with its 80% off armor enhanced defense, which basically makes it like an automatic low-level defiance for your character. To continue the Unique series, we have the handful of unique throwing weapons in Diablo 2. While few, they can be quite interesting, and with the changes coming to the Barbarian Double Throw, and to a lesser extent the Amazon Spear and Javelin skills, in 2.4 you may just want to consider some of these for your next build. While we are going to start with Javelins, it's important to note that the class-specific Amazon Javelins are already covered in the video linked in the description, along with the rest of the Amazon-specific Uniques. This is to keep them distinct from those more broad-reaching items. Another important note is that most of the throwing uniques benefit from a double mastery effect on barbarians. Javelins, for example, when thrown, benefit from throwing mastery, but when used in melee, they benefit from spear mastery. Similarly, throwing axes when thrown get bonuses based on throwing mastery, but when they're used with, say, frenzy, they get benefits from axe mastery instead. These don't stack up, but they do work kind of in tandem. So keep this in mind if you plan on using a Frenzy Throw hybrid. On that note though, let's start with Demon's Arch, the unique Balrog Spear. A relatively okay speed javelin which brings a decent mix of physical fire and lightning damage along with life leech and replenish quantity to the table, which you'll notice this is actually going to be a common theme among most of the throwing weapons. This unique javelin is fairly nice once you've kind of just compare it to the other javelins, due to the nice mix of damage types, though like the other javelins, it does struggle a bit with stack size compared to other throwing weapons. After that, we have Gargoyle Bite with comparable throwing damage, auto-replenish, and life leech. Basically, it's Demon's Arch in that regard, but a bit of lackluster poison theme instead, with Plague Javelin charges, mediocre poison damage over 10 seconds, and while this can be paired with Venom for a bit of an odd trick with the Poison Javazon, for example, it's still not going to be an amazing tool for most players, and since its melee damage is so low, you're not going to be able to take as much advantage of Spear Mastery for the potential short-range uses of it, for, say, the Frenzy Double Throw hybrid we mentioned earlier, so it may be a pass on that one. Third on the Javelin list is the always ethereal Wraith Flight. Like the rest of the Javelins so far, it gets decent damage boosts and life leech, as well as replenish quantity, though Wraith Flight's replenishment is a little bit faster than the other unique Javelins. The only other special perk that they get is mana per kill, which it can help you stay topped off mana-wise. Being always ethereal does make it a bit easier to find these with higher damage compared to the other unique javelins, though they can be ethereal as well and they do have replenished quantity. It's just a matter of hunting for them specifically. The big drawback for this javelin for me though is sadly the attack speed, which is sadly kind of slow. After that, we have the unique throwing axes, which are a bit faster and a bit more interesting, starting with the Scalper, which may look unimpressive, but remember that it can be upgraded into a flying axe, which makes the damage a bit more functional. With decent speed, decent damage boost, replenished quantity, a pinch of leech, as well as open wounds and attack rating boost, the Scalper has a lot of just good utilities. Even if it's not best in slot, it's definitely more than functional as a transition weapon without upgrading, or as a solid damage dealer when upgraded. Though probably the most well-known of the throwing weapons is the Lacerator Winged Axe, but it's not for its raw damage, which is just okay, but rather for its chance to cast Amplify damage on striking, which can greatly amplify the damage output of a number of throwing weapon builds in the game, since all but a select few are heavily physical damage based. This weapon also packs some other okay mods with open wounds, prevent healing, replenish quantity, and monster flee effect, which, since it's ranged, is not too bad, but does make it annoying if you're going to be charging up Frenzy or something with this axe in your hand. After that, we have the only throwing weapon that does not have auto-replenish, and that's Gimmershred. This unique flying axe does pack pretty solid elemental damage, as well as a decent physical damage and attack speed. Though unlike the other throwing weapons, it lacks the auto-replenish function, so it's a lot easier to run out of resources on, which often relegates it to the sidelines outside of specific use cases, or for people who don't mind repairing them more often. With 240 quantity, it can take a bit to burn through, but can be inconvenient to say the least, since you're essentially working with a single stack of bolts worth of attacks. And finally, we have the two throwing knives, first being Deathbit, the battle dart, the slower of the two, and also a bit lower on the damage front. This only sometimes sees use, but it can be a decent mid-tier throwing weapon thanks to the dual leech, attack rating boost, and deadly strike effects. It's not bad, it's just generally outclassed by its bigger brother in pretty much every respect. Which brings us to Warstrike, the big brother in question. It's got increased attack speed, which lets you spam it, more enhanced damage, which makes it have higher base damage, as well as packing 50% deadly strike, which gives you a better chance at doubling that damage. On top of that, it also packs replenished quantity and, more importantly, piercing attack, which gives you a 50% chance of piercing through an enemy like the Amazon skill does. I'm keeping an eye on this specifically, as well as a few others, since they plan to give the Barbarian throw skills a chance of piercing as well, which could push this close to, if not past 100%. Overall, while the Throw Barbarian is just okay in the current version, I'm definitely looking forward to giving these a spin in 2.4 for the Barbarian, as well as a few other characters, just to see how much they're actually going to get improved. And while I don't necessarily see it beating out the Pit Zerker meta or the Frenzy Uber Hunters, it should open up a new fun alternative for those of you that want to try it. A commonly requested addition to the unique item manual series for Diablo 2 has been the axes, which I have sadly put off a little bit because it is one of the more populated item types in the game with 28 official uniques, and that's before the weird, not quite an axe axes, only possible by crafting. I guess one could say the delay was because a case of axolotl. But god-awful puns about mispronunciations aside, we're starting at the bottom again, this time with an interesting axe used in many of the super low-level challenges, the Gnasher. This level 5 axe is what you'll often see people using for things like low-level Ubers, but it is also just a good weapon for a number of early builds because despite its lowish damage, it packs Crushing Blow and Open Wounds in decent amounts, which gives you a serious edge against bigger enemies like Act Bosses, which are generally the major threat in normal difficulty. Sadly, the next axe doesn't quite have the same amount of gimmicky utility, but it is still a decent weapon, and that is Death Spade, a better all-round weapon for whenever you can use it. Packing an attack rating boost, blind target, and mana per kill, it makes it a fairly solid early Zeal weapon for general use, and I have used it several times early on in solo self-found if it drops, though it doesn't scale very well, so you'll find yourself ditching it by late normal, or if you're really unlucky, early nightmare. Next down the list is the even more generic Blade Bone, a bit faster than the Death Spade at the cost of a little average damage. It's still a fairly decent early weapon that falls into the same category as Death Spade in that it is good enough early use, but it won't last you into Nightmare and it isn't really something worth upgrading for use later. After that, we have Skull Splitter, which I really like the updated graphics for in Diablo 2 Resurrected. It makes it look a lot more appealing than the tiny hatchet we had in Lord of Destruction. Though, like most normal one-handed axes, we've got a weapon you generally won't use outside of normal. And while a little more upgradable than the last two axes, it's still not worth burning the runes when you could just make a better rune word in Nightmare. With Open Wounds, blind target, and good speed, it's not the worst weapon, but it is getting close to that level cutoff. Last in the normal one-handers is Rakescar. It keeps the speed of the other fast normal axes, but does bring in about double the damage. Overall, a decent weapon to tide you over in late normal or even early Nightmare, and while it can't directly compete with some rune word options, it's a decent enough axe, and is actually an okay upgrade to exceptional thanks to the decent enhanced damage percent effect, and well, the speed, though I wouldn't bother taking it to elite. In the normal two-handed axe space, we start with the Axe of Fekmar, a rather fun low-level two-hander, which works fairly well early on when you don't really need a shield for durability purposes. It does okay damage for a level 8 weapon and packs in cold resist and target freezing, which can make it a pretty nice early on weapon, though it does quickly fall off on damage when we get into later normal, as many low-level items tend to do. Upping our damage a bit, we move on to Gore Shovel, packing, as we said, a bit more damage and a bit faster attack speed, not to mention open wounds and a fairly significant strength bump for the level, which will give you a little bit more damage. Overall, for me at least, I just treat it as a Malice competitor, though being two-handed axe does hurt it a bit there. Though if you want to get into weapons that actually make up for the lack of a shield with more than just damage, we have the Chieftain, a little slower than Gore Shovel, but a lot better enhanced damage, and it stacks on that with resists, lightning damage, and even mana per kill that can generally last you into early Nightmare, unless you find a better one-handed option to pair with something like a Rhyme, and it's pretty fun for a number of two-handed favoring builds regardless. On a little more elementally turned twist, we have Brain Hue, which lacks a little bit of physical damage compared to the Chieftain, but makes up for it with a big chunk of fire damage for the level, though it does lack resist and such. It does have a decent chunk of mana leech and bonus mana for more resource-intensive melee builds, though. So yeah, those may be fewer and further between, but it is there. Basically, it's a good axe, but there are better options than normal. That brings us to the last of the normal axes, Humongous. Quite a bit slower than all the other axe options we've looked at so far, but also significantly more damage per hit, and sneaking a bit of Crushing Blow in there to help in that regard as well. Honestly, if it wasn't so slow, it would be a fairly high pick, but that speed penalty generally keeps it on the sidelines for most builds, especially while leveling, since it's usually better to swing faster rather than just harder. As we move into the exceptionals, we start getting a few more useful tools as our damage and speed really picks up, even at the low end with Cold Kill, packing okay damage for early Nightmare, as well as being obviously cold themed with a chance to cast abilities, base cold damage, cold resist, and even okay enhanced damage. It's not going to really take you into hell difficulty, but it will do plenty of work in Nightmare when you find it. After that, we have Butcher's Pupil, an extremely useful axe for the mid-game. Heck, it can even be useful through the end of hell, mainly thanks to the solid one-handed damage, good speed, indestructibility, not to mention the deadly strike and open wounds, all at reasonable level requirements for its power and even stat requirements, and to this day it's one of my favorite mid-game zeal weapons. It's just solid and reliable. Next we have the Confused Druid Axe, Isle Strike, which isn't a bad weapon and may be a bit more usable in 2.4 due to the changes to Druid attack speeds, though in 2.3 or Lord of Destruction it always just felt too slow on the Druid. Thankfully in 2.4, as mentioned, we're breaking away from weapon-based attack speed on Druids and allowing all equipment to do it, basically letting you bring the Crushing Blow plus skills and okay damage to bear on this weapon, though I need to retest it to really see if it can outperform the other weapons you'll find at this tier, since it's definitely on the edge of whether it's going to be really good or just kind of disappointing. Less on the edge is Pompey's Wrath. Some people like it, and it does have some okay mods with chunky bit of fire damage, Volcano on striking, slow target, and mediocre damage, but decent speed. The big problem I have with it, and you've probably already guessed, knockback. If it had something to make it more useful versus bosses specifically, maybe it'd have a use, but frankly, this one is just one of a few exceptional axes I just give a hard pass on, unless I'm running something very weird that doesn't get bothered by the knockback. Back in the realm of doing some okay damage is Guardian Naga. It's not amazing compared to some of the previous stuff, but it's also not bad, with decent damage, a bit of poison, and even a chance of casting Poison Nova if you like that. It does okay for a cheap, exceptional axe, and I've used it a few times on solo self-found runs, but never really bothered to equip it on my endgame builds. Onto the two-handers, we have Warlord's Trust, which if you're going to use it, you'll want to grab an ethereal one if possible, since it's auto-repair, but without being ethereal, its damage just can't justify the two-handed nature of it, even with resist, defense, and vitality bumps. That said, our next one is actually often overlooked, and that's Spell Steal. Basically a fancy teleport staff for most people, but it can do okay damage even if it's a bit slow. By packing the charge's heavily reduced requirements and extra mana and mana regen, it actually can be a decent substitute for some other things, though it does have significantly less charges of teleport than a standard teleport staff, much less something like Naj's Puzzler. Though it does actually also pack Decrepify, which can be useful and is a bit more unique to this specific weapon. Another axe that suffers from kind of bad attack speed on what would otherwise be a good weapon is Storm Rider, and as you can tell by the name, it's all about that lightning damage with plenty of chance to cast, added lightning damage, retaliatory lightning damage, and actually not terrible per hit physical damage. The problem though is that the speed is bad for most popular main attacks, though it can be okay with some niche builds for a mid-game weapon. I generally don't use this very often. Though to make up for that, we have Boneslayer Blade, which while just okay in 2.3, I have a feeling at least someone, even if it's just me, is going to make a gimmick build for this in 2.4. Though, unfortunately, due to that Holy Bolt being when struck rather than on striking, it's only going to be so useful, and it's going to be a very niche side weird-ass build. That said, it is a fast axe with good damage and a fairly decent punch to undead, just in general. It's definitely a decent mid-game unique to find and use regardless, though there are better weapons in the long run. The last of the exceptional axes is another slow boy, the Minotaur, packing Crushing Blow, slow target, blinding, and a few other nice mods, not to mention actually pretty solid damage. For a build that can get away with slower attacks, it's pretty decent, though like most other slow weapons, these are niche builds rather than meta builds, so you'll only rarely see people using this in the wild for good reason. Last up, we have the Elites, which actually pack a few fun alternatives to the other popular weapons, starting with the overlooked Razor's Edge. It packs decent damage, good percents of deadly strike and open wounds, and even defensive piercing, along with decent swing speed. This is a solid weapon for general use. It's not going to beat out weapons like Grief by any means, but until you get to the post game, it can easily take you through the end of hell. After that is Rune Master, which can spawn naturally with 3 to 5 sockets, with generally only 5 socket ones being used for any real build options, and even then usually only ethereal ones being used for like main kind of weapons, which is really uncommon but strong for the specific use case. The reason this axe is so fun though, even outside of that, is that it's really flexible to your needs, and by packing Cannot Be Frozen and okay damage on top of its base, it is a solid base that isn't really easily replicated through any other means. If you're looking for more speed though, our next axe is Crane Beak, with really nice attack speed, okay damage, defense piercing, lightning damage, and a bit of magic find to boot. It's never really best in slot, but it can do decent work for builds going through hell that just want some pocket magic find and decent damage without sacrificing speed for something like Alibaba. I rarely ever use this axe, but I do like the look of it and can see some mid-game uses for it personally. The last of the elite one-handers is Death Cleaver, also fast with a bit better damage and packing on top of that Deadly Strike to double that damage. This weapon is often overlooked due to how uncommon it is, and that grief is just, well, better, but as a general use weapon, it's still fairly solid, especially since it does a decent bit more damage than you'd guess at first glance thanks to that Deadly Strike. Moving to the two-handers, we have Ethereal Edge, a decent enough axe, mainly because it's always ethereal and has some okay damage perks. It's just not fast enough for most builds that would use it, and you can generally get better weapons for most of your two-hander builds by the point you start being able to even use this. Basically, it's pretty solid if you haven't found better, but there are a lot of better options that you can kind of pick from. After that, we have Hellslayer, a weapon that becomes stronger the higher level you are, but due to its slow speed, is stuck in certain niche builds for usefulness, like several of the other big hitting two-handers. Packing crazy boost to maximum damage as well as per level boost to strength and vitality, it's pretty much its claim to fame, along with a pinch of extra fire damage. I generally end up preferring something faster though. You know, something like Messerschmitt's Reaver, which will usually end up with similar average damage, but has much better base speed, has a solid attack rating boost, and a bump to all attributes. This actually used to be one of the more popular axes back in the old days, but it quickly fell off with unique update passes and rune words and stuff like that and skill changes, and it's never quite come back to the meta, so I may just be biased to like it for nostalgia's sake, and it kind of looks cool, though I do wish the axe head was a little bit bigger. And the last of the official axes is Executioner's Justice, which would be nice if that Decrepify was on striking rather than kill, but that aside, it's still a fairly decent axe with solid damage, crushing blow, and defense piercing, and the attack speed boost helps overcome a bit of the notorious Glorious Axe slowness. Now, you may have noticed there's more axes here, and that's because there's a few unofficial axes you can get by upgrading quest items, such as Malice, Hellforge Hammer, and Staff of Kings, among others, which can result in some weird, unexpected weapons, even stuff like this Roderick Staff Tomahawk. Though yeah, none of them are broken, just fun and weird, and you get them through crafting and upgrading stuff that you normally wouldn't. And as always, if you enjoyed this or found it useful, a like helps out a ton, and as always, keep gaming, have fun, and peace out. This has been Alzorath. Bye. In Diablo 2, the unique scepters may not be used as much as other blunt weapons, but they still offer some very interesting options, especially if you consider that they're not only valuable to paladins, but also to barbarians, since Mace Mastery also applies to staves, wands, and scepters. Starting out at the bottom, we have the normal scepters like Nell Striker, a very solid weapon for only requiring level 5 and 25 strength, with really good enhanced damage for the level and okay, albeit small attack rating boost, not to mention fire and poison resist boosts. That alone would make this a good low-level weapon, but add in the 25% crushing blow, and you have another low-level competitor on par with weapons like Rixit's Keen, which basically can be used from start to finish in normal if you're lucky enough to find them. The next unique scepter is not quite as broken, but it's still solid, and that's Rust Handle. Plus paladin skills, a bit of weaker enhanced damage keeping it from being good upgrade candidate unfortunately, but with the life leech and skill boost it can do enough work to carry its weight through normal until you can find something better, and with Holy Fire Paladins being a very common low level build for getting through normal, that plus skill does go a bit further than one would normally expect. After that, we have Storm Eye, which again is good but not great, though due to the level requirement that begins counting as a bit more of a ding against it. It does have okay enhanced damage, but it is plus elemental damage is just paltry, so the only real use of this scepter ends up being mediocre physical damage whenever you can use it, a bit of replenished life, and maybe making it worth switching over to a Holy Shock build, but there are much better options for that even early on, so it basically gets relegated to only being used if I find it in a solo self-found run and still haven't found found a better weapon. In Nightmare, things start to look up a little bit with Zakarum's Hand, an actually fun mid-level zealot weapon with solid attack speed, good enhanced damage, ignore target defense, and mana leech. It's a good option for a zealot and easily beats out Stormeye if you're going the Oradin zealot route with Holy Shock or Holy Freeze in Nightmare, since it provides another boost to those as well. And while it's not especially powerful, the chance to cast Blizzard on striking does give you a pinch of area elemental damage for helping with the physical resistant or immune enemies if you are not going the Oradin route we mentioned earlier. Next is Fetid Sprinkler, an underrepresented weapon mostly due to its slower attack speed. It sits in a weird space with its abilities, packing plus skills, decent damage, not to mention attack rating and poison damage. It would still be a solid weapon without its chance to cast abilities, but with them it gets a bit confused, albeit still functional, since it runs 2 curses on striking, a 10% chance of casting, well, Confuse, as we mentioned, and a 5% chance of Decrepify. It won't be consistent, and it would be better with just Decrepify, but they're both good control curses at least. The last exceptional is Hand of Blessed Light, the unique scepter that often gets mislabeled as the Fist of the Heavens scepter, thanks to the obvious plus skills. But the reality is it's a fairly decent scepter that just happens to have skill bumps. This is mostly because it's got a reasonable speed weapon with good damage and attack rating boost that's fairly solid. Is it going to be broken or overpowered? No, but it will hit hard enough to get your basic needs taken care of. Now, as we've noticed in a lot of the other weapons, the elites like to double up on specific bases. In this case of scepters, this is the Mighty Scepter, the lowest one. Though, unlike other weapons, the double up on this is a lot more balanced between the two, with the first one, Heaven's Light, packing solid speed plus skills, pierce defense, and enhanced damage, which would make it okay on its own. But this weapon has those alongside natural sockets and crushing blow, allowing you to turn it into a fairly dangerous one-handed weapon in its own right, at least until you find the runes for something like Grief. Though on the subject of Grief, the other Mighty Scepter is Grief's little brother, the Redeemer. This is because it packs the elusive damage plus modifier and in a decent value as well. Beyond that though, it's your fairly run-of-the-mill unique Paladin Scepter with plus skills, damage boosts, etc., along with a little defense piercing and extra low stat requirements. Though one of the plus skill bumps it gives, well, is Redemption, which is, well, you kind of predicted it from the name. It's a nice little pocket rejuvenation potion made of corpses. So you can sneak a sip without having to invest in all of the prerequisites for Redemption, which is kind of a nice thing to have. The last of the unique scepters is really uncommon to find, but it's kind of a weird mashup of the last two, and that's Astrion's Iron Ward, which I've only found ethereal ones of. Yes, 2 of them, but no, they're not naturally ethereal, that's just what I've found. Simply put, this unique scepter slaps in a lower value version of that damage plus modifier, but adds in the crushing blow and slow target to help it out a bit. As far as the plus skills, this one's limited to combat skills rather than all skills, so it won't bump your auras any, but it's fine. And this also gives you a chunk of pure magic damage as well as a hefty bump to attack rating to help you hit even more. It's a solid weapon if you find it, but its base makes it painfully hard to find for its strength, since you'll usually find stuff for Grief long before finding a unique Caduceus. Now, if you're curious about other Paladin weaponry, we did already cover the Paladin shields in another video, you'll find that linked at the end, but like most other martial classes, you don't need to use the flavored weapons to really get punch out of the character, you just need to use the strongest one for your personal abilities. Among the sadly most forgotten uniques of Diablo 2 are the two-handed wonders known as Staves, though just because they're often forgotten doesn't mean they lack power. In fact, hidden in this list is a competitor for one of the best two-handed weapons in the game, as well as a few exceptional finds for luckier solo self-found gurus out there. Though, starting out, you might not believe as much, since the first one is the unique short staff known as Bane Ash, which, while better than the starter staff for the Sorceress, is fairly unimpressive, outside of basically shoring up a Firebolt Sorceress until you can get to level 19 for that Leaf staff, since it is a little scattered all over the place in terms of mods. But the next staff, Serpent Lord, is a little bit different. While not best in slot for any major builds, it does pack a fairly unique set of mods that can be used with a number of, well, strange builds, most specifically the 100% mana leech and the minus enemy defense, that can be used for a number of niche builds for their early game periods, at least until they can get a hold of their mid to late game options. After that is Spire of Lazarus, the lightning-themed normal staff. While we're still dragging through the unfortunately underwhelming starter staves, the Spire is okay enough for a solo self-found build, since it saves you points in getting static field and also provides you mana regen and lightning resist, a decent amount of lightning resist to that, and can be one of a number of choices to tide you over until you reach the level of a Spirit Sword. Though, sort of remotely staying on that rune word subject with the Spirit Sword, we have the Salamander, a weapon that would be amazing and interesting with plus fire skills, good points in Fire Wall and Fire Ball, except for one issue: its higher level requirement and harder to find than a leaf staff with similar functionality. So while it may be a collector's item, I frankly don't see a use for this even on the fringes in today's Diablo 2. Last of the normal unique staves is the Iron Jang Bong, which falls into a category similar to the Spire of Lazarus, with some sorceress perks making it an okay weapon for her. Though, due to its level requirement, it pushes much closer to being usable around the same time you'd already be getting one of the plus skills from spirits. So yeah, the Bong lacks resist, so I'd probably actually prefer the Spire for low-level sorceress staff options, and a Spirit Sword for the mid-level stuff, if I didn't happen to have something better by that point. Moving into the exceptional staves, we actually have weapons that are a bit more promising, starting with Razor Switch, the first staff that offers proper plus all skills instead of just plus sorceress. This also packs in other useful mods such as life, mana, and chunky all resist to make up for the lack of a shield. Though while this is actually a pretty fun little staff, you're again going to be better off with a good resist shield and a Spirit Sword, but at least this gets a bit closer to useful. Now, by now you'd probably be thinking these staves all sound like a waste, but our next staff is actually competitive with some of the best weapons in the game. And that is Ribcracker, with massive increased attack speed, hit recovery, crushing blow, and reasonable damage, combined with the fact that staves actually benefit from mace mastery as well, making this a great weapon for whirlwind barbarians as well as just angry fury druids looking for a good two-hander. It's also pretty common to have a Ribcracker upgraded to elite, though if you're going to do so, realize that in stalagmite form, which is the elite version, it is slower, so you may actually need to shale or attack speed jewel it to maintain breakpoints. After that, we go back to, well, mild disappointment, though not as drastic, with Chromatic Ire, with +3 sorcerer skills, faster cast, and plus masteries, combined with maximum life increase by percent, which makes it okay, and 30% all resists. It at least does make up a bit for the lack of a shield, but does not quite make a big enough gap to overcome similar level options. In a similar situation is Warp Spear, which weirdly enough almost gets there, just doesn't quite have the right plus skills for me to like them in a melee sorceress, and it lacks the extra perks necessary to become a good melee weapon for other characters. That said, it is a good backup weapon if you're looking to temporarily snag an energy shield without investing in points, though there are better runeword options for that if you get the good base for them. Last up is the exceptional Skull Collector. +2 all skills, chunky mana boost, decent mana per kill, and a level-based magic find percent. It can be a fun tool for quirky magic find builds, but you generally will find better options before you get to this. And without faster cast, resist, or defensive perks, I cannot really justify using this weapon outside of, well, aesthetic reasons for the Skull Staff. Though, speaking of faster cast and defense, the first staff we see in the elite category is Ondal's Wisdom, packing that faster cast that we mentioned, a decent chunk of defense, and a varying amount of plus all skills. It is also the only weapon source of bonus experience gained, which can help out with certain goals if you're really desperate, though often you will stick with just a nihilist for that, but this can help. I have used it while farming some easier areas, but as you get up into the higher tier stuff where you have to be farming specific late game areas, if you're wanting to like do a level 99 challenge or something like that because you're totally masochistic, you'll often want to go with something more optimal, deadly, etc. to speed up the killing process even more rather than solely relying on making each kill worth more. Lastly is Mang Song's Lesson, one of the harder to find items in the game. It packs +5 all skills with a decent amount of faster cast and a bonus to piercing enemy cold, fire, and lightning resistances. It can be as low as 7% but as high as a 15% pierce, which can be nice but sadly only comes into usefulness with certain side builds, since a lot of main builds that desire this effect pull it from different equipment more focused on their specific goals. As it stands, staves definitely have uses, it's just due to being two-handed, they tend to fall into very specific niche use cases, or as just until I get better items type gear. Out of all the uniques in the game, these and Daggers often fall into my wish list of gear that would get some upward tweaks in later patches. One of the more overlooked, but also one of the most powerful unique item categories in Diablo 2 is the humble little wand. Often passed over as being a weapon solely for the Necromancer, it packs surprises for a number of niche builds that are second only to the best in slot high-end rune words for them. Though starting out in normal, you can tell why this misconception is so common, since we started with the difficult to find Torch of Ero wand, which seems confused to say the least, with some useful traits such as plus Necromancer skills, an energy bump, as well as mana regen. It makes an okay early caster wand for the Necromancer, though you'll likely never ever really find a use for its fire damage outside of Act 1, or its life leech. You generally just won't find a use for that ever. But at level 5 required, it is a super early source of the coveted plus skills for a Necromancer. Moving to the It's You Not Me wand, Maelstrom, we actually have a wand that is fairly good for early sorceresses until they can use Leaf, mainly because it packs a decent increased cast speed, as well as extra mana and lightning resist. That said, it is still better for the Necromancer, as most of these will be, because they can take advantage of the various plus skills for the different areas, most notably the Corpse Explosion and Amplified Damage, in case you're trying to optimize for your summons and don't want to burn points into the support skills just yet. That said, a summoner would still benefit more from plus all skills than necessarily just saving points by using this. The potency of the plus all necro skills starts to be seen in our next two uniques, starting with Graven Spine, the less desirable of the two usually, but still quite good. Considering level 20 for plus 2 all necro skills is still, well, super early, and it's not a bad wand considering it gives you stat bumps to strength and dexterity, as well as some pocket mana, among some other unnecessary mods like cold damage and mana leech that you'll probably never actually take advantage of. The reason it's considered the weaker of the two is because our next wand, Ume's Lament, comes with the same plus 2 Necromancer skills but slips in faster cast rate, as well as Decrepify points to save you from having to go down the tree early. Yes, it's a bit higher level requirement at level 28, but it's still good for its level, and it even slips in a little bit of mana to help you with that, since builds like the Bone Necromancer will almost always still be struggling on mana by the point where you get this. But moving from normal into exceptional, we start to see wands really branch out into utility for other classes, starting with, well, Suicide Branch, the unique burnt wand, which outside of Heart of the Oak is pretty much a caster's dream, with plus 1 all skills, a whopping 50% faster cast rate, a small bump to life, a decent bump to mana, as well as resist all, and a pinch of damage to attackers. There really is not a bad aspect to this wand, and it can actually be tied for the biggest faster cast bump of any one-handed weapon. After that, though, we have something significantly less impressive, and that is Karen Shard, the pseudo-summoner wand. While not bad, it just rarely sees use since lower wands are a lot more competitive, and you'll start finding it a bit after you can make spirit weapons. It packs plus 1 to Necromancer skills, and then an additional plus 2 for summoning skills specifically. Its main perk over other wands, since it has slower, faster cast, is the fact that it packs faster hit recovery as well as scaling health and mana. Though on the downside, scaling health and mana is less helpful for overall boost since it's added after the percent bumps rather than before. The other reason it's used less is because at one level higher, you get access to the Arm of King Leoric, which gives you bigger bonuses to the specific summons most Zoomancers are interested in, at least, thanks to a specific skill boost combined with its necro-only boosts. The Arm also only packs 10% faster cast, and it does keep the mana per level effect as well from the previous wand, though personally, I'm not the biggest fan of this because it comes with a major drawback, not dissimilar to the Oculus and its teleport, except in this, it will trap you in with enemies due to its 10% chance to cast Bone Prison when struck, so you need to be extra aware of your positioning while using this, though thankfully as a standard summoner you should almost never be getting hit unless you're out of position. At the end of the exceptionals, we actually have a wand that used to be fairly heavily sought after, and is still fairly nice for a Bone Necromancer wand if you have not gotten the IO for, say, a white wand, and that is Black Hand Key, which is just nice with plus 2 Necromancer skills, as well as a bonus to curses, but more importantly, a faster cast boost, flat life boost so it's applied before the percent increases, as well as fire resist and damage taken goes to mana, and with version 2.4 releasing soon, those Grim Ward charges may just become kind of useful, just depending on how they interact with curses. In the elite category, we have two wands, the less spoken about being, well, Bone Shade, another competitor for white and black hand key. It packs plus to all skills, a 25% faster cast, and plus to individual skills of varying values. A high-end version of one of these can be a fairly solid wand for a Bone Necromancer, though often a Bone Spear-oriented white wand ends up being preferred for maximizing damage output on the pure Bone users, while Summoners and Poison Necros will often prefer their more specific tools as well. Last, and the exact opposite of least, we have pretty much the most desirable wand period, and that is Death's Web. Most often gotten for use on a Poison Nova Necromancer, its stats are pretty much perfect for it, with negative enemy poison resist, as well as life and mana recovery per kill, plus to poison and bone skills on top of the +2 for all skills. Though, since it is plus all skills, it's one of those odd items I will take a glance at whenever they do poison skill changes, because it can greatly impact a number of different skills, and while it's not best in slot for a lot of these builds, it can be a kind of fun alternative, or good for people who are going for pure poison challenges. All that said, while yes, wands are mostly Necromancer oriented, their fringe uses for other classes are definitely worth keeping in mind whenever you're playing something that's a non-standard character like a Crybarb, a poison user, or even just a low-level caster looking for a low-level wand with good faster cast. So it's usually a good idea not to overlook these little 2-slot wonders. To round out the Diablo 2 game manual series for Uniques, we're finishing up with one of the more important slots in the game, shields. The only way for non-assassins to fully block attacks, and a key resource of multiple important character modifiers. Now, in this video, we will just be covering the standard shield since we already have independent videos for both the Necromancer heads and the Paladin specific shields, which you'll find linked at the end of the video. Now, even at the low end, we immediately get into why these are key tools with Pelta Lunata, a level 2 light shield with decent stat boosts and even defense for its level, but most importantly, reasonably boosted block chances and speeds for how early you get it, well, equip it at least. This is an excellent tool to pair with Rixit's Keen for early setups on characters, since you can start using it before you leave Bloodmoor and it'll last you for many more levels on at least your melee characters. And the energy and vitality boosts on the shield are actually pretty solid for anyone at this level. After that, we have the Light Shield Umbral Disc, which continues the trend of block chance boosts, but this time pairing it with blind target, life, and defense, and even more importantly, dexterity, which will help you translate this to higher base block into a reasonable actual block chance. This has less to offer to non-melee characters, but is still a nice shield to have early on until you can get up to the stage of using rune words and such. Storm Guild again raises the bar for blocking even further, this time with a bit more of a lightning theme as well, packing a pinch of lightning damage, but more importantly lightning resist and magic damage reduction at about the level requirement you would be just entering late Act 1 and early Act 2, where you'll start seeing lightning become a threat with Tainteds and Beetles, all at a reasonable strength requirement, though that note, it is a medium shield. It does come with a bit of a sacrifice on movement speed. Steel Clash, however, is a shift back to the light shields and provides a slew of bonuses that, while obviously better for a paladin, are actually solid on any character, since sure, it has +1 to paladin skill levels, but also packs a significant resist all boost, some damage reduction, as well as a decent block chance and block speed boost to help you out. And since this is a light shield, which means it doesn't give you penalties to run walk, it is actually fairly solid for movement speed as well. Not to mention it makes underground or dark areas far less oppressive since it has a decent light radius boost to boot. Moving to something a bit more utility driven, we have Swordback Hold. Again, it has a boosted block chance and it is a light shield, but it packs an instance of a utility effect that's actually really useful early on, Open Wounds, which much like Umbral Disc's Blind will apply to your normal attacks. And with a 50% chance to apply it, it will be a very reliable tool against tougher bosses, as well as in preventing enemies from regenerating life. Finally, we get to a shield I don't use very often, Bavaric Keep, which isn't a bad shield by any means. It still maintains a reasonable block chance along with a few other nice minor mods like strength and magic damage reduction, but its claim to fame is the 75% fire resist. Unfortunately, this is all on a heavy shield, which will make you move significantly slower, and we just had several shields with far more utility. Generally, the only time I'll use this on solo self-found is against Diablo, since otherwise his Firestorm really hurts, but we do have other options, especially by the time you get to the 75 strength to use this. After that, we have a shield that I actually love but has sadly been almost forgotten about, and that's Wall of the Eyeless. One of the best early caster shields you could wish for, and actually not a terrible option for early zealots either, thanks to the mana leech and the ability to use Holy Shield to overcome the block chance. The main advantages of this shield though are the 20% faster cast rate and the mana per kill, and a bit of the poison resist is just nice to have. I still use this on solo self-found, but it sadly, that's if I find it, but sadly and quickly gets dropped for rune words later on for various reasons, though as a light shield it can beat out a number of the more weighty options. And the last of the normal shields is the Ward, a medium shield that sadly gets ignored a bit, mainly because by the time you get this, you'll often have access to competitive rune words like Ancient's Pledge, but as a shield in and of itself, with plus strength, solid resist, and magic damage reduction, it's not a bad shield to use in a pinch, and is at least competitive with these rune words or gemmed options, that you can always get those in a light form, whereas this one will slow your roll because it's medium. Moving into the exceptionals, we have Viscera Tuant, a light shield with an annoying history for me, mainly because it used to be a +2 Necromancer shield that was actually halfway decent, and then it became a +1 Sorceress shield that just feels blah in comparison. It's got okay block chance and such, but since it lacks most of the mods anyone other than a melee sorceress would want, I'll give it a skip usually these days. Though what I won't give a skip to is Moser's Blessed Circle. A rather infamous light shield among veterans, this shield comes naturally with 2 sockets, decent enough block boost, and a solid resist all modifier, making it one of the best resistance shields for non-paladins, and frankly one of my favorite general use shields in the game to tide me over until I get whatever best in slot shield I need for a given character. After that, we have Storm Chaser, a medium shield that just always felt confused to me. It's basically an upgraded Storm Guild though, with more lightning resist, some added cast when struck effects, more lightning damage, and some attack rating and freeze duration modifiers. It sadly just doesn't impress me much compared to other items you can find in the exceptional space, so while I do tend to keep one, I almost never use it. One shield that does get use in some odd niche builds though is Tiamat's Rebuke, a light shield that also packs a lot when struck effects, but more importantly packs resists and elemental damage. This elemental damage makes it a really solid leveling option for a number of niche builds, one of the more popular ones being things like Melee Sorceress, since she can amplify these elemental sources fairly easily. It is also a fairly nice pick for just dealing with physical immunes for other classes, since while there are better options later, this is still a fairly common unique, and it can tide you over in much the same way that people use Gimmer Shred for. Next, we have a light shield that got nerfed out of my usual use for it, and that is Lance Guard, the Deadly Strike shield, which until 2.4 was my go-to shield for Blade Fury assassins. Though with Phoenix no longer interrupting casts, the main reason for using Lance Guard there is gone. That said, it is still an okay shield, just relatively easy to beat out by any number of other options except in very niche use cases, though I will use it on solo self-found melee builds if I need to hit recovery and deadly strike at least. Back to another heavy shield, we have Gurkey's Sanctuary, which sadly falls into a similar realm as Bavaret's Keep, in that it's definitely interesting with solid resist, replenish life, block chance, not to mention actually fairly decent amounts of damage reduction, both physical and magical, but with heavy armor penalties and a fairly high strength requirement for what it does. It's usually a shield you only use for very specific builds, unless you're doing, say, solo self-found on a tankier melee character, or you're doing say a PvP damage mitigation build very specifically. Something a bit more broadly appealing is Lidless Wall, a light caster shield that generally usurped Wall of the Eyeless simply because it packs +1 skills, faster cast rate, mana boost, and mana per kill. It's actually a fairly solid caster shield and is one of the lower strength alternatives people will use instead of Spirit, since it requires almost 1/3 the strength of the lowest strength non-paladin spirit you can make. The shield's main competitor in this strength range is Splendor, though generally speaking Lidless will beat it out for anyone except for Necromancers, since 20% magic find usually is not worth the loss of basically half your casting speed bonus, but on a Necromancer shield you can get plus skills and put that in it. The last of the exceptional shields is Radament's Sphere, a shield I really wish was better given its namesake, but the reality is it's basically the Bavaret's Keep of poison, with 75% poison resist, some block, and some poison perks. It generally is just left on the ground by most players for good reason. It just lacks any really solid utility that other shields can bring you at this level, and it lives far short of its namesake. Finally, we start off in the elites with Black Oak Shield, another light shield option, but it can't usually be recommended. It's a scaling shield, with its bonuses becoming better with level, namely pump to dexterity, life, and even cold absorb, making it a fairly decent anti-cold shield or a dexterity bumper, and while it does have a few other fun mods, it just doesn't quite compete with anything else outside of very specific use cases. Next though, we have what used to be one of the most popular shields, and nowadays is still a decent shield that is used in a few builds, and that's Storm Shield. This indestructible shield used to be the go-to shield because of its 35% damage reduction effect, as well as other decent mods like blocking, strength, and resist, though after some game changes that came to the game many patches ago, the damage reduction became a little superfluous, though on builds that don't quite hit the 50% damage reduction mark, it still can be a solid pick to up your durability significantly, and is still a relatively safe pick for a shield on a number of builds who just need a defensive pick-me-up on a lightweight shield. After that is Spike Thorn, which, like its smaller cousins, has damage return and even packs faster hit recovery like Lance Guard, though what sets it apart is that it packs variable percent damage reduction and comes naturally with a socket to allow you to modify it to your needs. You'll rarely see this on an actual build though, since there are better socketed shield options, but it can still be fun on weird stuff like pacifist builds, though it's not always the first pick. Now Medusa's Gaze is next in line and is actually the most fun of the 3 heavy tower shields, with lower resist when struck, life leech, slow target, and cold resist. It is more of a gimmick shield than anything, but that lower resist proc can be used for some fun quirky builds. It will never be best in slot or even actually that great for a lot of builds, but I do keep a couple around for more strange or even stupid build ideas. As we near the end, we have a shield that veterans respect, but that most people seem to ignore, and that's Headhunter's Glory. A good shield for making some more focused builds thanks to naturally getting a variable number of sockets, though the only one that most people will bother keeping is the 3-socket version, and that is because it has advantages very much in line with Jeweler's shields, or simply put, a lot of open sockets with some good support mods. In this case, some resist, defense, and life per kill. The more popular use of this shield is to plop rainbow facets or specific jewels in it that will greatly augment a given build. Personally, I want to use the shield more often, especially since I have several of them now, but finding the jewels you need and then sparing them for this rather than other pieces of gear can be a bit more of a challenge, since there are, well, far less of the things you put in this than the shield itself. The last of the unique shields is Spirit Ward, a medium shield with resist all, cold absorb, some block boosts, and it casts Fade when struck. The shield is often ignored by players, 1 because it's not the usual best in slot lists, and 2 because people are usually using high-end rune words or build-specific shields by the time this comes along. That said, if you need to proc Fade, this is not the worst option. I mean, the worst option wouldn't have it, though admittedly it is significantly easier just to make a Treachery, or if you're on the rich end of things, a Last Witch will fare better, so it leaves us in a slightly awkward space. That said, if you found this or any of the other game manual videos useful, a like really helps out the channel, and of course, a special thanks to the channel members and patrons that make this possible.